To support her child, a single mother takes a job caring for a paraplegic billionaire, but during her work, an unexpected revelation touches her heart in ways she never imagined. Hello, viewer. Thanks for joining us. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. The alarm buzzed sharply at 5:30 a.m., cutting through the dense quiet of the tiny Queen's apartment. Emma Stanton groaned softly, silencing the sound with a practiced swipe before sitting up on the edge of her bed. The room was cold. The old heater wheezed but rarely delivered, and her thin blankets offered little insulation against the December chill. She stretched for a moment, blinking into the early light that seeped through the worn curtains, then reached for her slippers, worn soft from years of use. Her day, like every other, had begun. In the kitchen, her son Jake sat at the table, legs swinging, humming a tune under his breath. At 5 years old, he had an infectious energy that filled their cramped apartment with life. His laughter often masked the strain Emma carried daily, a weight she never let him see. She poured milk into his cereal, smiling as he chattered about his favorite cartoon. Jake was her reason for everything. 3 years earlier, he had been a frail toddler, diagnosed with a congenital heart defect. The memory of those hospital days haunted her still. The pale blue of his skin, the hum of machines, and the sobering words of the doctor explaining the cost of the surgery he so desperately needed. She had resigned herself to losing him until a call from the hospital changed everything. A donor had paid for the procedure in full. Even now, she didn't know the benefactor's identity, but their generosity had saved Jake's life. Her reverie broke as Jake grinned up at her, milk dripping from his chin. "Mama, you're not eating," he declared, his small voice pulling her back to the present. She tousled his hair, a tender gesture that steadied her. Breakfast finished quickly, and soon Emma was wrapping Jake in his puffy red coat, preparing to drop him off at school before heading to her shift. She worked as a waitress in a small diner a few subway stops away, her uniform smelling faintly of grease no matter how many times she washed it. The pay was meager and the hours grueling, but it was honest work. Still, it wasn't enough to keep up with rent, utilities, and the mounting debts she'd accrued during Jake's recovery. That morning, the landlord's notice pinned to their door was a fresh reminder of her precarious position. The bold type seemed to mock her. Final notice. "You'll figure it out," she whispered to herself as she tore it down, folding the paper into her purse to keep Jake from seeing it. Later, at the diner, Emma worked the lunch rush with her usual determination, balancing trays and taking orders with a polite efficiency that belied her exhaustion. Her co-worker Rosa, a vibrant woman in her 50s, watched her with a mix of admiration and concern. During a rare quiet moment, Rosa handed Emma a steaming mug of coffee and said, "You look like you haven't slept in weeks. What's going on?" Emma hesitated. She rarely shared her struggles, not out of pride, but out of fear of pity. "It's just the rent," she admitted finally. "I'm behind again, and if I can't pay by the end of the week..." She trailed off, unable to say the words. Rosa nodded solemnly. "You know, my cousin works for an agency that finds caregivers. They've got a client looking for someone, pays real well. Not gonna lie, though, the guy's a piece of work. But it might be worth checking out." Emma's first instinct was to dismiss the idea. She had no formal training in caregiving, and the prospect of working for someone difficult made her stomach turn. But the image of Jake, his small hand clutching hers as they walked to school that morning, lingered in her mind. She couldn't afford to be picky. After her shift, she called the number Rosa had scribbled on a napkin. The woman on the other end of the line, brisk and professional, scheduled an interview for the next day. "The position is for a private client," she explained. He requires full-time care and prefers discretion. Emma hung up with a mix of apprehension and hope. The path ahead felt uncertain, but she had no choice but to follow it. That evening, after tucking Jake into bed, she sat by the window, staring out at the city lights. For him, she murmured, resolving to do whatever it took to keep her son safe and sheltered. The following morning, as Emma buttoned up her coat and prepared to leave for the interview, Jake hugged her tightly. "Good luck, Mama," he said with a grin that lit up his whole face. She kissed his forehead, drawing strength from his joy. For him, she could face anything. The gates of the Wheeler estate loomed ahead, wrought iron twisted into intricate patterns that seemed more suited to a palace than a private home. Emma stood outside them, clutching her coat against the biting wind. She'd ridden the subway for nearly an hour and walked another 20 minutes to reach this address. The agency had provided scant details. A wealthy, reclusive client in need of care after a life-altering accident. They'd warned her the man was difficult, but the salary, triple her current pay, was impossible to ignore. With a deep breath, she pressed the intercom button. A woman's voice, crisp and no-nonsense, came through. "State your name and purpose." "Emma Stanton. I'm here for the interview." A buzz sounded, and the gates swung open slowly. Emma stepped inside, her boots crunching against the gravel driveway as the mansion came into view. The house was enormous, all sleek modern lines and glass, surrounded by meticulously trimmed hedges and trees. It felt cold, not just from the weather, but from its sterile perfection. It was a world far removed from her tiny queen's apartment. At the door, a woman in a tailored grey suit greeted her. "I'm Margot Adams, Mr. Wheeler's personal assistant," she said, shaking Emma's hand briefly. Her expression was professional but unyielding. "Come in. I'll explain everything before you meet him." Inside, the house was just as imposing as the exterior. Polished marble floors gleamed under soft recessed lighting. Artwork hung on the walls, each piece carefully chosen to exude sophistication. Emma felt small and out of place, but she forced herself to focus. This was for Jake. Margot led her to a study, where two leather chairs faced each other across a glass coffee table. "Please, sit," Margot instructed, taking the seat opposite Emma. "Let me be frank. Mr. Wheeler is not an easy man to work for. He's particular, demanding, and less than personable. You'll need patience and resilience to last even a week." Emma nodded, keeping her expression neutral. "I understand. Your responsibilities will include assisting with daily tasks, administering medication, and accompanying him to appointments. He prefers minimal interaction, so don't expect warm conversation. He values discretion above all else." The way Margot spoke, it sounded less like a job and more like a test. Emma wasn't sure whether she was meant to feel prepared or intimidated. She glanced at the framed photo on the bookshelf behind Margot, a younger man with a confident smile and piercing blue eyes, posing beside a helicopter. "Is that him?" she asked. Margot turned briefly to look, then faced Emma again. "That was Mr. Wheeler before the accident." Emma hesitated. "What happened to him?" Margot's expression softened, just a fraction. "A helicopter crash 2 years ago. He lost his wife and young son that day. He survived but was left paraplegic. Since then—" She trailed off, her gaze steady but shadowed. "Let's just say he hasn't adjusted well." Emma swallowed, the weight of the story settling over her. She couldn't imagine such loss. Suddenly, the coldness of the house and the warnings about Mr. Wheeler made more sense. Margot stood abruptly. "Wait here. I'll see if he's ready." As Margot left the room, Emma took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Her palms were damp and her heart raced. The sound of wheels on hardwood caught her attention, and she turned just as Margot returned, pushing a man in a sleek black wheelchair. Thomas Wheeler was nothing like the photo. His once vibrant blue eyes were cold, and his features, though still striking, were lined with bitterness. His gaze swept over Emma, assessing her with a sharpness that made her feel exposed. "This is the applicant?" he asked Margot, his tone clipped. "Yes, Mr. Wheeler," Margot replied. Thomas wheeled himself closer, his eyes never leaving Emma. "You've worked as a caregiver before?" Emma straightened her posture. "No, but I've cared for my son during difficult times. I'm a fast learner." He scoffed lightly. "Your son? What kind of difficult times?" Emma hesitated, debating how much to reveal. "He had a serious heart condition. He's better now, but I understand what it's like to care for someone who needs help." For a brief moment, something flickered in Thomas's expression, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "We'll see if you last longer than the others," he said, wheeling himself toward the door. Over his shoulder, he added, "Margot will show you out." Emma watched him leave, her heart pounding. His words were a challenge, not an offer. As Margot escorted her back to the entryway, she said quietly, "The agency will contact you if he decides to hire you. Good luck. You'll need it." Outside the gates, Emma exhaled deeply, the weight of the interview pressing on her. She had no idea if she'd get the job, but one thing was clear. Thomas Wheeler was a man cloaked in pain, and for reasons she couldn't yet explain, she felt compelled to help. 2 days later, Emma's phone buzzed while she was scrubbing the kitchen sink. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and checked the screen, her heart leaping at the name of the agency. Answering quickly, she braced herself for rejection. "Miss Stanton." The familiar, clipped tone of Margot greeted her. "Mr. Wheeler has decided to offer you the position. Can you begin tomorrow morning?" Emma's breath caught. Yes, I can. Be punctual. 7 a.m. sharp." The line went dead before Emma could respond. She stood in her small kitchen, the phone still in her hand, feeling a swirl of emotions, relief, fear, and a twinge of something unexpected. Hope. The next morning, she left Jake with Rosa, who had kindly agreed to babysit. "You're gonna do great," Rosa assured her, hugging her warmly. "Just remember why you're doing this." Emma nodded, kissing Jake on the cheek. "Be good, sweetheart. I'll see you tonight." As she approached the Wheeler estate, the same imposing gates greeted her. They seemed even taller today, as if the weight of her new responsibilities had somehow magnified their height. When Margot opened the door, her expression was as steely as before. "Follow me," Margot instructed. Emma fell into step behind her, clutching her bag tightly as they wove through the sprawling house. They stopped at a set of double doors, which Margot opened to reveal an expansive living room with floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the frosted garden outside. Thomas Wheeler was in his wheelchair by the fireplace, his back to them. "Mr. Wheeler," Margot announced, "your new caregiver has arrived." He turned slowly, his sharp eyes locking onto Emma. "Punctual. That's a start." Emma felt her stomach tighten but forced a polite smile. "Good morning, Mr. Wheeler." "I don't care for pleasantries," he replied, his tone clipped. "Margot, go over her duties." Margot handed Emma a folder. "This outlines everything you need to know: his daily schedule, medications, dietary preferences. He doesn't like to repeat himself, so read it thoroughly," Thomas interrupted, his voice cutting through the room. "I don't need someone hovering over me. You'll do what's required and leave me alone. Clear?" Emma nodded, feeling a mix of annoyance and determination. "Understood." Margot excused herself, leaving Emma and Thomas alone. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. Finally, Thomas broke it. "Why did you take this job?" Emma met his gaze, steady despite her nerves. "I needed it." That's obvious. But why this job? He pressed, his voice tinged with disdain. Do you think you'll fix me? Make me less of a burden? Emma inhaled sharply, his words catching her off guard. I don't think you're a burden, Mr. Wheeler. I think you've been through a lot, and everyone deserves to be treated with dignity. His eyes narrowed, and for a moment she thought he might snap at her. Instead, he wheeled himself closer, studying her face. We'll see how long your optimism lasts. The rest of the day was a test in patience. Thomas was particular to the point of absurdity. He criticized her for the way she folded his blanket, the temperature of his tea, and even how she adjusted the blinds. But Emma remained calm, refusing to let his sharp remarks get under her skin. By late afternoon, Thomas had retreated to his study, leaving Emma with a brief reprieve. She used the time to review the folder Margot had given her, making notes about his medications and therapy sessions. She was struck by how rigid and isolated his life seemed, every moment accounted for, yet devoid of any warmth or connection. As the day drew to a close, Emma prepared to leave. Margot met her at the door, her expression unreadable. You handled yourself well today, she said, a hint of approval in her tone. Most people don't make it past lunch. Emma smiled faintly. I'm not most people. Margot's lips twitched, almost forming a smile. Good. You'll need that attitude. On the subway ride home, Emma replayed the day in her mind. Thomas Wheeler was as difficult as promised, hostile, guarded, and deeply bitter. Yet beneath his sharp words and cold demeanor, Emma sensed something else. Pain, certainly, but also a faint glimmer of the man he might have been before tragedy struck. When she walked into her apartment, Jake ran to greet her, his arms wrapping tightly around her legs. How was work, Mama? He asked, his eyes bright with curiosity. Emma crouched to his level, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. It was interesting, she said with a small smile. But it's going to be okay. And for the first time in a long while, she believed it. The next morning, Emma arrived at the Wheeler estate just as the sun began to rise. Frost glistened on the hedges lining the driveway, and her breath puffed visibly in the icy air. Margot greeted her at the door with the same stern professionalism, handing her a clipboard with a detailed schedule. Stick to this, Margot instructed. Mr. Wheeler despises disruptions. Emma took the clipboard, nodding firmly. Understood. Thomas was already in the living room when she entered, seated by the same floor-to-ceiling windows. The early sunlight outlined his rigid posture, and his wheelchair was positioned as if he were daring the day to challenge him. Without turning, he acknowledged her arrival with a curt, "You're on time again." Emma set her bag down and approached cautiously. "Good morning, Mr. Wheeler. I've reviewed the schedule and—" "Schedules are for people who care about the future," he interrupted, his voice edged with cynicism. "Let's get on with it." The day began with a series of mundane tasks, each accompanied by Thomas's sharp observations. He directed her on how to adjust his seat cushion with precision, dictated the exact amount of water he wanted in his glass, and insisted on an exact angle for the blinds to minimize glare. Emma followed his instructions without complaint, though she felt her patience stretching thin. By mid-morning, it was time for his physical therapy session. Ethan, the physiotherapist, arrived with a cheerful energy that clashed with the somber atmosphere of the house. A tall man with kind eyes and an easy smile, he greeted Emma warmly. "You must be the new caregiver," Ethan said, shaking her hand. "Welcome to the lion's den." Thomas, overhearing, grunted. "Don't charm her, Ethan. She doesn't need false hope," Ethan chuckled, unbothered by Thomas's tone. "And you don't need to be such a grouch, but here we are." Emma couldn't help but smile at Ethan's light-hearted approach, though she kept her expression neutral. The session began with stretches and light resistance exercises, which Ethan guided with patience and expertise. Emma observed quietly, ready to assist if needed. At one point, Ethan glanced at her. "He's doing better than he lets on," he said, a twinkle of mischief in his eyes. "Don't let him fool you." Thomas shot Ethan a warning look. "Focus on your job." As the session ended, Ethan pulled Emma aside. "He acts tough, but don't take it personally. Deep down, he's just scared like anyone else." Emma nodded, appreciating Ethan's insight. "Thanks for the advice." The afternoon brought more challenges. Thomas had a meeting with his financial advisors over video call, during which his temper flared repeatedly. Emma stayed nearby, organizing files and keeping his medications on schedule, but his frustration seemed to fill the room like static. When the call ended, he wheeled himself toward her, his expression a storm. "Do you know how to read financial reports?" he demanded. Emma blinked, caught off guard. "I've never—" "Of course not," he snapped, his tone cutting. "Figures, never mind." Before she could respond, he turned away, leaving her standing there, unsure whether to feel insulted or amused. She chose the latter, realizing his anger wasn't truly aimed at her. By early evening, the tension had softened slightly. Emma brought him tea, setting the tray carefully on the small table beside him. To her surprise, he didn't critique her effort this time. Instead, he stared at the cup in silence, his eyes distant. "I used to hate tea," he said suddenly, his voice quieter than she'd ever heard it. Emma hesitated, sensing the fragility of the moment. "What changed?" He didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his words were edged with a vulnerability she hadn't expected. "It was my wife's favorite. After the accident, I couldn't stand the smell of it. But now—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Now, it's all I can taste." Emma's throat tightened. "I'm sorry," she said softly, knowing how inadequate the words were. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Don't be. Pity doesn't help." She didn't argue, choosing instead to sit in the quiet with him. For the first time, the silence between them didn't feel hostile. It felt human. As she prepared to leave that evening, Margot intercepted her at the door. "You're handling him better than most," she said, her voice lacking its usual edge. Emma managed a small smile. "I'm learning." Margot nodded. "Good. Just remember, he's not the only one being tested." Emma carried those words with her on the subway ride home, mulling over their meaning. When she arrived at her apartment, Jake greeted her with his usual exuberance, and the weight of the day lifted slightly. As she tucked him into bed, she thought about Thomas's fleeting moment of vulnerability and wondered what tomorrow might bring. The morning air bit sharply as Emma walked briskly to the Wheeler estate. Each step felt heavier than the last, weighed down by the question that had kept her awake most of the night. Could she continue this job? Thomas Wheeler was an enigma, his hostility often unbearable, but his fleeting moments of vulnerability hinted at a depth Emma couldn't ignore. When she arrived, Margot greeted her with her usual efficiency, handing over the day's updated schedule. "He has a video conference at 10 and therapy at 2. Stick to the plan." Emma nodded, filing the clipboard under her arm. Margot paused, her gaze softening. "If it's too much," she began, but trailed off, leaving the unspoken thought hanging in the air. "I'll manage," Emma replied firmly, though the uncertainty in her own voice surprised her. As she entered the living room, Thomas was already there, seated by the window as usual. He didn't acknowledge her, engrossed in a book. Emma approached cautiously, setting his morning tea on the small table beside him. "Good morning, Mr. Wheeler," she said, keeping her tone light. "Too early for pleasantries," he muttered without looking up. Emma resisted the urge to sigh. Instead, she busied herself with straightening the room, subtly observing him as she worked. He appeared calmer today, though the tension in his posture never fully left. The quiet stretched on until he finally closed the book with a deliberate snap. "I suppose you're settling into this routine," he said, his tone neutral. Emma turned, caught off guard by the lack of sarcasm. "I'm doing my best." Thomas regarded her for a long moment. "And yet you haven't left. Most people do by now." She hesitated, unsure how to respond. "I'm not most people." His lips twitched, almost forming a smile. "So I've noticed." The morning passed uneventfully, though Emma remained on edge, waiting for the inevitable sharp comment or impossible demand. When the time came for Thomas's video conference, she stood by discreetly, ensuring his documents were organized and his medications within reach. To her surprise, the meeting ended without incident, and Thomas even thanked her, gruffly but sincerely, when she handed him a folder. By early afternoon, the monotony began to wear on Emma. She spent her break sitting on a bench in the garden, the cold air refreshing her mind. Ethan, arriving early for Thomas's therapy session, found her there. "Taking a moment to breathe?" he asked, settling onto the bench beside her. Emma smiled faintly. "Something like that." "He's not an easy one," Ethan said, his tone thoughtful. "But I think you're getting through to him." Emma glanced at him, skeptical. "You think so?" Ethan nodded. "I've worked with Thomas for over a year. He's still stubborn as hell, but he doesn't push everyone away anymore. Not completely, at least." Emma absorbed his words, uncertain whether to feel encouraged or overwhelmed. Before she could respond, Ethan stood and clapped her lightly on the shoulder. "Hang in there. You're doing more good than you know." The therapy session that followed was uneventful, though Thomas's usual sarcasm was notably absent. Emma couldn't tell if it was progress or simply exhaustion on his part. As the day wound down, she prepared his evening tea, setting it on the table beside him. "Why do you stay?" he asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. Emma froze, his question catching her off guard. "I have my reasons. Care to share?" She hesitated, then chose her words carefully. "Because I believe people deserve second chances." His gaze sharpened, and for a moment, Emma wondered if she'd said too much. But instead of snapping at her, he leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Second chances are a luxury, Miss Stanton. Not everyone can afford them." Emma met his eyes, steady despite the unease creeping through her. "Maybe. But sometimes they're worth fighting for." Thomas didn't respond, but the flicker of something, respect, perhaps, in his eyes stayed with her as she left for the night. On the subway ride home, Emma replayed their conversation in her mind. His walls were still firmly in place, but cracks were beginning to show. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her decision. She would stay, at least for now. If there was even the smallest chance she could help Thomas, and by extension herself, she had to try. As she tucked Jake into bed that night, he looked up at her sleepily. "Did you have a good day, Mama?" She smiled, brushing a curl from his forehead. "I think I did," she murmured. For the first time in weeks, she felt a small, tentative hope stirring within her. Emma arrived at the Wheeler estate early the next morning, greeted once again by the crisp December air and the imposing gates. The house, with its sleek glass panels and manicured gardens, still felt unwelcoming. But Emma had grown accustomed to its cold elegance. Inside, Margot was waiting, her usual clipboard in hand. "Good morning, Miss Stanton," Margot said without looking up. "Mr. Wheeler has his routine therapy session this afternoon, but before that, he's requested a meeting. He rarely does this, so be prepared." Emma blinked, surprised. "A meeting?" About what? Margot's lips curved slightly, almost imperceptibly. That's for him to decide. Emma didn't press further. Instead, she made her way to the study where Thomas was already waiting. He sat by the large window, the sunlight casting harsh shadows on his angular face. His expression was thoughtful, almost contemplative, as he turned to face her. "You're early," he remarked in his tone neutral. "I try to be," Emma replied simply, standing near the doorway. Thomas gestured toward the chair opposite him. "Sit. We need to talk." Emma obeyed, her stomach twisting with unease. His directness always left her unsettled. "What's on your mind, Mr. Wheeler?" He studied her for a moment, his sharp blue eyes searching. "Why do you think you can handle this job?" The question was blunt but not unexpected. Emma took a steadying breath. "Because I don't give up easily." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "A noble sentiment. But determination only gets you so far. This isn't an ordinary caregiving job, Miss Stanton. It requires resilience, intelligence, and a level of patience most people don't have." "I'm aware," Emma replied, her voice steady. "And I believe I have all those things. Do you?" His tone was almost challenging, but there was a hint of curiosity beneath it. "Yes," she said firmly, meeting his gaze. "I've faced harder things in my life than this, Mr. Wheeler, and I've come through them stronger." For a moment, the room was silent. Then, to Emma's surprise, Thomas's lips twitched in the faintest hint of a smile. "We'll see." The conversation shifted abruptly as Thomas began discussing his therapy schedule, medications, and preferences for the day. Despite his initial sharpness, Emma noticed a subtle change in his demeanor, a willingness to engage, however minimal it might be. It wasn't much, but it felt like progress. Later that morning, Margot approached Emma in the kitchen, where she was organizing Thomas's medications. "You handled that well," Margot said, her tone softer than usual. Emma glanced up, surprised. "Thank you." "Thomas isn't an easy man to deal with," Margot continued, leaning against the counter. "But he respects strength. If you want to last here, you'll need to keep showing him that you're not afraid of him." Emma considered Margot's words carefully. There was something almost protective in the older woman's tone, a quiet encouragement that felt out of place in their otherwise formal interactions. "Have you worked for him long?" Emma asked. Margot nodded. 8 years. I knew him before the accident. He was a different man then, kind, generous, always looking forward. But that part of him is gone now." Her expression darkened. "Or buried so deep, it might as well be." Emma hesitated. "Do you think he can change?" Margot's gaze softened slightly. "That depends on him, and perhaps on the people around him." The conversation stayed with Emma as the day progressed. Thomas's therapy session with Ethan was uneventful, though Emma noticed he seemed more willing to follow instructions than usual. Ethan, ever cheerful, made light conversation as he guided Thomas through stretches and exercises, occasionally glancing at Emma with a knowing smile. "Whatever you're doing, keep it up," Ethan said to her afterward. "He's actually listening to me today. That's a first." Emma smiled faintly, though her thoughts remained elsewhere. Margot's words lingered in her mind, planting a seed of determination. Perhaps Thomas's walls weren't impenetrable after all. Perhaps there was a way to reach him. As the day wound down, Thomas called for Emma to bring his evening tea. She found him in his study, staring at a photo on his desk, a candid shot of him with his wife and young son, their faces lit with laughter. Emma paused, unsure whether to interrupt. "They were everything," Thomas said quietly, his voice breaking the stillness. "And I failed them." Emma's chest tightened at the raw pain in his words. She placed the tea gently on the desk beside him. "You didn't fail them," she said softly. "What happened wasn't your fault," He didn't respond, but the way his hand lingered over the photo told her he was listening. For the first time, Emma saw not the harsh, guarded man she had grown accustomed to, but a grieving father and husband, clinging to the fragments of a life he'd lost. As she left the study that evening, Emma felt a flicker of hope. The walls Thomas had built around himself were strong, but perhaps not unbreakable. All it might take was patience and someone willing to believe in him. Emma arrived at the Wheeler estate the next morning with a renewed sense of purpose. The faint progress from the previous day gave her hope that Thomas's hardened exterior might not be as unyielding as it seemed. As she stepped inside, Margot handed her the day's schedule. "Mr. Wheeler has requested something unusual," Margot said, her tone laced with curiosity. "He wants to go outside." Emma paused, surprised. "Outside?" Margot nodded. "The garden, specifically. He hasn't set foot outside the house in months. I'd suggest you encourage it. It might do him good." Emma folded the clipboard under her arm and made her way to the living room, where Thomas was seated by the window as usual. His gaze was distant, fixed on the frost-covered lawn beyond the glass. "You wanted to go outside today?" Emma asked gently. Taking a cautious step closer, Thomas turned his wheelchair slightly, eyeing her with his usual skepticism. "Margot tells me fresh air is good for the soul," he said dryly. "I'm not convinced, but the monotony of this house is unbearable." Emma smiled faintly. "A change of scenery can't hurt. Let me grab your coat." Minutes later, Emma pushed Thomas's wheelchair onto the paved garden path, the crisp winter air biting at her cheeks. The garden was vast, a series of winding paths surrounded by dormant flower beds and bare-limbed trees. Despite the season, the space held a quiet beauty, the frost glinting like diamonds in the pale sunlight. Thomas's expression was unreadable as they moved through the garden. He remained silent, his posture stiff, but Emma noticed the way his eyes lingered on the trees and hedges, as if searching for something familiar. "This place must have been beautiful in the spring," Emma said, breaking the silence. Thomas snorted softly. "It was. My wife loved this garden. She spent hours here, planting flowers, tending to every detail. After the accident," he trailed off, shaking his head. "I couldn't bear to look at it." Emma slowed her pace, letting the weight of his words settle. "Maybe it's time to let the garden be what it is now," she said carefully. "A reminder of her love, not just a source of pain." He didn't respond, but his jaw tightened, a flicker of emotion passing through his eyes. As they rounded a corner, a small stone bench came into view beneath a towering oak tree. Emma stopped the wheelchair beside it, stepping back to let Thomas take in the view. The branches stretched overhead like a canopy, their bare tips reaching for the sky. For a moment, the silence between them felt heavy, yet peaceful. "You have a way of saying things that make sense, Miss Stanton," Thomas said finally, his voice quieter than usual. Emma smiled softly. "I think sometimes we just need someone to remind us of what we already know." His lips curved slightly, almost imperceptibly. "Perhaps." They lingered in the garden for a while longer, the cold air biting but bearable. Emma didn't rush him, sensing that this was a rare moment of calm for him. Eventually, he nodded, signaling that he was ready to return to the house. Back inside, Emma helped him remove his coat and settle back into his spot by the window. Margot appeared with a tray of tea, raising an eyebrow at Emma as she set it down. "Well?" Margot asked. Emma glanced at Thomas, who was already engrossed in the view outside. "I think it went well," she said quietly. Margot gave a small nod of approval. "Good. Keep it up." As the day continued, Emma noticed a subtle shift in Thomas's demeanor. He still carried his usual edge, but it seemed less pronounced. During lunch, he asked her a question about Jake, his tone almost conversational. Your son? How old is he? 5, Emma replied, surprised by the question. He's full of energy. Keeps me on my toes. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. Boys that age have a way of making you feel alive. My son was the same. Emma hesitated, sensing the ache behind his words. I imagine he was a lot like you. Thomas's gaze sharpened briefly before softening. He was better. The conversation ended there, but Emma carried the exchange with her throughout the rest of the day. It was the first time Thomas had voluntarily opened a door to his past, and though the glimpse was fleeting, it felt significant. As she left that evening, Emma found herself glancing back at the house. The imposing structure no longer felt quite so forbidding. Beneath its cold exterior, warmth was beginning to stir, small, tentative, but real. On the subway ride home, Emma replayed the moments in the garden and at lunch, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. Thomas Wheeler was still a long way from healing, but for the first time, she believed he was willing to try. And that, she thought, was a victory worth savoring. Emma arrived at the Wheeler estate early, as she always did. But the atmosphere inside the house felt subtly different. There was an energy that hadn't been there before, a quiet hum of life beneath the surface. She couldn't pinpoint its source, but something about the way Thomas had lingered in the garden the previous day, the small moments of openness, hinted at a shift. It was fragile, but it was there. Margot greeted her at the door with her usual clipboard. "Good morning, Miss Stanton," she said briskly. "Today is a lighter day for Mr. Wheeler, but he's requested assistance organizing his study." Emma nodded, slightly surprised. "Organizing? Is that something he usually cares about?" Margot's lips twitched, just barely. "Not typically, but it seems he's taking an interest in his work again, which is a good sign. Try not to disrupt his focus." Emma made her way to the study, a room she had only glimpsed briefly before. It was a large, sunlit space with shelves of books lining the walls, every title meticulously arranged. The desk in the center of the room was an island of chaos. Papers, folders, and binders piled haphazardly, alongside a sleek laptop and a crystal paperweight. Thomas was already there, his wheelchair positioned at the desk as he sifted through the clutter. "You're early," he remarked without looking up. "You're busy," Emma replied, stepping closer. "How can I help?" Thomas gestured vaguely at the piles. "This mess needs order. If you're as competent as Margot claims, you'll figure it out." Emma raised an eyebrow but said nothing, setting her bag down and surveying the desk. She began sorting through the papers, dividing them into neat stacks, financial reports, correspondence, and personal notes. As she worked, she caught glimpses of Thomas's world, sharp analyses of business ventures, carefully worded letters to colleagues, and sketches of designs that hinted at an engineering mind still active despite his isolation. "You used to design things," Emma said, holding up a blueprint she'd uncovered in the pile. Thomas glanced at it briefly. "Still do, on occasion." "They're impressive," she added, meaning it. The intricacy of the designs and the precision of the calculations were far beyond her understanding, but she could tell they were the work of a meticulous and brilliant mind. He shrugged. "It's nothing. A way to pass the time." Emma set the blueprint aside carefully. "It's more than that. These could make a difference." Thomas's gaze flicked to her, his expression unreadable. "Not everything needs to make a difference, Miss Stanton. Sometimes it's just about keeping the mind occupied." They worked in silence for a while, the occasional rustle of papers the only sound. Emma noticed that Thomas seemed more engaged than usual, his movements sharper, his focus intense. It was a stark contrast to the apathy she'd seen in him just days before. At one point, she came across a photograph tucked into a folder. It was a candid shot of Thomas with his wife and son, standing in front of the very helicopter that would later take their lives. The sight of it made her chest tighten. Thomas noticed her hesitation and glanced at the photo. "That was taken the day we bought the helicopter," he said quietly. "They were so excited about it. I wasn't even supposed to be flying that day." Emma placed the photo down gently. "I'm sorry." He didn't respond immediately, his eyes fixed on the image. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "You know, for a long time, I thought it would have been better if I hadn't survived, that they wouldn't have had to lose so much because of me." Emma swallowed hard, her instinct to comfort him clashing with the enormity of his grief. "I don't think that's true," she said softly. "You're still here, and that matters. Maybe not to you right now, but it does." Thomas looked at her sharply, as if searching for hidden meaning in her words. For a moment, she thought he might argue, but instead, he nodded almost imperceptibly. "Perhaps," he said, his tone neutral but not dismissive. By the time they finished organizing the study, the space looked entirely different, clean, ordered, and purposeful. Thomas seemed satisfied, though he didn't say so directly. As Emma packed up to leave for the day, Margot caught her in the hall. "Good work today," Margot said, her voice unusually warm. "He hasn't touched that study in months." Emma smiled faintly. "It's a start." On the subway home, Emma reflected on the day's progress. Thomas's grief was a constant shadow, but she could see glimpses of the man he might become again. Someone driven, thoughtful, and quietly kind. She wasn't sure how far they'd come, but for the first time, she believed the journey was worth it. Emma arrived at the Wheeler estate to find the house unusually quiet. Margot wasn't at the door as usual, and the faint hum of activity that typically accompanied the mornings was absent. As Emma made her way inside, she found Margot in the kitchen, sipping a cup of coffee and glancing through her clipboard. "Good morning," Emma greeted, setting her bag down. Margot nodded in return. "Morning. Mr. Wheeler has been reflective today. He's in the library." Emma raised an eyebrow. "Reflective?" Margot gave a small shrug. "It happens on occasion. Be prepared for anything." With that cryptic remark, Emma headed toward the library. She found Thomas sitting near one of the towering bookshelves, his wheelchair angled toward the window where a faint winter light streamed in. On the table before him was a thick, leather-bound journal. He looked up briefly as Emma entered. "Miss Stanton," he greeted, his tone neutral. "You're early." "You've mentioned before that you appreciate punctuality," she replied, offering a faint smile. "What are we working on today?" Thomas gestured toward the table. "I thought we might sort through some of this. Notes, sketches, remnants of old ideas." "If it's useless, toss it." Emma approached cautiously, glancing at the journal and the scattered papers around it. The sketches caught her eye, intricate designs of machinery, some annotated with precise measurements. "These are incredible," she remarked, picking up one of the drawings. "They're unfinished," Thomas replied dismissively. "Projects I never had the chance to complete." Emma set the paper down gently, sensing the frustration in his voice. "Why not finish them now?" Thomas gave her a wry look. "And what would be the point? To prove to yourself that you can," she said simply. "Not everything has to serve some grand purpose. Sometimes it's enough just to create." Her words seemed to strike a chord. He regarded her for a long moment before gesturing for her to sit. "Fine," he said. "Let's see what you can make of this mess." Emma settled into the chair across from him and began organizing the papers. As she worked, she noticed recurring themes in his designs: efficiency, elegance, and a focus on accessibility. It became clear that even in his grief and isolation, Thomas's mind had been active, searching for solutions to problems others might not have considered. Some of these could make a real difference, Emma said, holding up a sketch of what appeared to be a lightweight wheelchair prototype. Have you ever thought about patenting them? Thomas scoffed lightly. Patents require effort, Miss Stanton, and collaboration, neither of which I have much interest in. Emma bit her lip, debating whether to push further. Finally, she said, "You've been through so much, but you're still here. That has to mean something." Thomas's expression darkened, but there was a flicker of something else. Doubt, perhaps. Curiosity. "You're annoyingly persistent," he muttered. "It's part of the job," she replied with a small smile. The day passed slowly, but with a surprising sense of purpose. Thomas allowed Emma to assist him in sorting through more designs, and even entertained her suggestions on organizing his notes. By mid-afternoon, the piles of scattered papers had transformed into neat stacks, each labeled and categorized. As they worked, Thomas spoke more freely than usual, sharing snippets of his life before the accident. He talked about his early days in business, his passion for innovation, and how his wife had always encouraged him to dream big. Emma listened intently, grateful for the glimpse into a side of him she rarely saw. By the time Emma prepared to leave, the library felt transformed, not just physically, but emotionally. The space, once a shrine to unfinished dreams, now felt like a place of potential. Thomas seemed lighter, too, though his guarded demeanor never fully left. As Emma gathered her things, Thomas called out to her. "Miss Stanton!" She turned, meeting his gaze. "Yes, Mr. Wheeler." He hesitated for a moment before saying, "Thank you, for today." Emma's chest tightened at the unexpected gratitude. "You're welcome." On the subway ride home, Emma found herself smiling. The day's progress had been slow but meaningful. Thomas Wheeler was still a man burdened by his past, but for the first time he seemed willing to look toward the future. And for Emma, that was enough to keep going. The following morning, the Wheeler estate buzzed with an energy Emma hadn't seen before. As she stepped through the front door, Margot greeted her with a brisk nod. "Good timing," Margot said, handing Emma a revised schedule. "Mr. Wheeler has a visitor today. I thought you should know." Emma blinked. "A visitor? Who?" "Ethan, his physiotherapist," Margot replied, "but this isn't a routine session. Ethan asked for some time to speak with Thomas about a new initiative." Emma's curiosity piqued as she headed to the living room. Thomas was already there, sitting stiffly in his wheelchair with an expression that bordered on irritation. Ethan stood nearby, his usual cheerful demeanor slightly more subdued. "Morning, Miss Stanton," Ethan greeted as Emma entered. "I was just about to make my pitch." Thomas let out a low sigh. "Pitch away, Ethan. Let's get this over with." Ethan grinned, undeterred by Thomas's tone. "Right. So, there's a new program I'm involved with. It's focused on designing adaptive technologies for people with disabilities. We're partnering with engineers and designers to create tools that make everyday life easier." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "And what does this have to do with me?" "Well," Ethan continued, "you have the kind of experience and insight we need. Plus, you've got a knack for designing things. I've seen your work, Thomas. You could make a real difference." Thomas's gaze hardened. "I'm not interested in charity projects." "It's not charity," Ethan countered, his voice firm but friendly. "It's about creating solutions, empowering people to live better lives, including yourself." Emma watched the exchange carefully, noting the way Thomas's fingers tapped lightly against the armrest of his wheelchair. A sign, she thought, of conflicted emotions. "I'm not a symbol, Ethan," Thomas said after a long pause, "and I'm certainly not a salesman." Ethan shrugged. "You don't have to be. Just share your ideas. That's all anyone's asking." The room fell silent. Finally, Thomas turned his gaze toward Emma. "What do you think, Miss Stanton?" The question caught her off guard, but she answered honestly, "I think you have a chance to take what you've been through and turn it into something meaningful. And I think that matters." Thomas's expression softened slightly, though his tone remained guarded. "You're both relentless, aren't you?" "It's a gift," Ethan replied with a grin. To Emma's surprise, Thomas didn't dismiss the idea outright. Instead, he agreed to think about it, though his reluctance was clear. Ethan, seeming satisfied, gave Emma a quick thumbs up as he left the room. Later that afternoon, Emma found herself alone in the kitchen with Margot, who was preparing tea. "What did you think of Ethan's proposal?" Emma asked, her voice casual. Margot glanced at her, then returned to her task. "I think it's exactly what Thomas needs, though he'd never admit it. He's been stuck for so long, unable to see a way forward. Something like this could remind him of his own capabilities." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "It feels like a step in the right direction." Margot handed her a tray with 2 cups of tea and a plate of biscuits. "It's more than that. It's a chance for him to reconnect with the world, even if it's just a little." Emma carried the tray to the living room, where Thomas sat by the window, his gaze distant. She set the tea on the table beside him and hesitated before speaking. "Ethan's idea, it's a good one," she said quietly. "You have so much to offer, even if you don't see it yet." Thomas looked at her sharply. "And you think this will fix everything?" "No," Emma replied honestly. "But it's a start." He didn't respond immediately, his gaze returning to the frost-covered garden outside. After a long silence, he said, "I'll think about it." It wasn't a commitment, but it was more than she had expected. Emma felt a flicker of hope as she turned to leave. That evening, as Emma rode the subway home, she reflected on the day's events. Thomas's walls were still firmly in place, but cracks were beginning to show. Ethan's visit had planted a seed, and Emma could only hope it would grow. When she arrived at her apartment, Jake greeted her with his usual exuberance. "Mama, did you help Mr. Wheeler today?" Emma smiled, brushing a curl from his forehead. "I think I did." As she tucked Jake into bed, she thought about the journey ahead for both herself and Thomas. It would be long and uncertain, but for the first time, it felt possible. And that, she realized, was enough. The day began quietly at the Wheeler estate, the early hours marked only by the hum of activity as the house staff moved through their routines. Emma arrived as usual, greeted by Margot's efficient nod. The air felt heavier today, though Emma couldn't pinpoint why. "Good morning, Miss Stanton," Margot said, handing Emma the day's schedule. "Mr. Wheeler has a meeting with the board of his company at noon. It's virtual, but it's important. He'll need everything prepared beforehand." Emma noted the tension in Margot's voice. "Is something wrong?" Margot hesitated, glancing over her clipboard. "His cousin, Victor, will be attending the meeting. Let's just say their relationship is strained." Emma frowned. "Should I be worried?" "Just be ready," Margot said cryptically before walking away. Emma spent the morning ensuring that everything was set for Thomas's meeting. His notes were organized, his laptop was charged, and the room was arranged for optimal comfort. When she brought Thomas his coffee mid-morning, he was already reviewing documents, his expression hard and focused. "Everything's ready for your meeting," Emma said, setting the coffee down beside him. "Good," Thomas replied curtly, not looking up. His tone was sharper than usual, but Emma let it slide, sensing his nerves. The meeting began promptly at noon, and Emma stayed in the background, ready to assist if needed. The virtual conference screen filled with faces, board members, executives, and, as Margot had warned, Victor Wheeler. Victor's polished appearance and smooth demeanor stood in stark contrast to Thomas's guarded intensity. From the start, Victor dominated the conversation, steering it toward topics that painted Thomas in an unfavorable light. "With all due respect, Thomas," Victor said, his tone laced with feigned concern, "your condition limits your ability to lead effectively. The board deserves someone who can be fully present." Thomas's jaw tightened. "My condition doesn't affect my ability to make decisions. My track record speaks for itself." Victor gave a patronizing smile. "No one is questioning your past achievements. But the company needs forward-thinking leadership, someone who can meet the demands of today." Emma clenched her fists as she watched Thomas endure Victor's thinly veiled attacks. The tension in the room was palpable, each word a calculated attempt to undermine Thomas's authority. Despite his composure, Emma could see the strain in his eyes. When the meeting ended, Thomas slammed his laptop shut with a force that made Emma flinch. "Parasite," he muttered under his breath, his hands gripping the armrests of his wheelchair tightly. Emma approached cautiously. "Are you okay?" Thomas looked up at her, his expression stormy. "Do I look okay?" Emma hesitated, then said softly, "He's wrong. You know, you're more than capable." Thomas scoffed, turning his gaze toward the window. "Words mean nothing, Miss Stanton. Victor's been circling like a vulture for years, waiting for the chance to take what's mine." "Then don't let him," Emma said, her voice firm. "You've fought through worse than this, haven't you?" Thomas didn't respond immediately, his shoulders tense. Finally, he said, "Leave me. I need time to think." Emma obeyed, retreating to the kitchen where Margot was waiting. "How bad was it?" Margot asked, pouring herself a cup of tea. "Bad," Emma admitted, sinking into a chair. "Victor didn't hold back," Margot sighed heavily. "He's been trying to push Thomas out since the accident. He's ambitious, and the board listens to him because he knows how to manipulate them." Emma frowned. "Isn't there anything Thomas can do?" "There is," Margot said, her voice steady. "But he won't. He refuses to lean on others, even when it's in his best interest." Emma thought about Thomas's stubborn independence, the walls he'd built around himself to keep everyone at arm's length. It was both his greatest strength and his deepest flaw. That evening, as Emma prepared to leave, she found Thomas in his study, staring at the same photograph she'd seen before, the one of him with his wife and son. He didn't look up as she entered. "I've failed them," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. "Everything they believed in me, it's gone." Emma's chest tightened. "You haven't failed anyone, Thomas. You're still here. That means something." He finally met her gaze, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and despair. "What does it mean, Miss Stanton? Tell me, because I'm struggling to see it." Emma swallowed hard, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "It means you still have a chance to prove them wrong, to prove to yourself that you're more than what Victor or anyone else thinks." For a moment, Thomas said nothing, his gaze locked on hers. Then he nodded, almost imperceptibly, before turning back to the photo. As Emma left the house that night, she felt the weight of the day pressing on her. Thomas Wheeler was fighting battles on every front, against Victor, against his own doubts, and against the scars of his past. And though she couldn't fight for him, she could stand by his side. For now, that was enough. The cold morning sunlight filtered through the windows of the Wheeler estate as Emma stepped inside, her breath still visible from the freezing air outside. Margot met her in the foyer, clipboard in hand as always. "Today will be challenging," Margot said, her voice low. "Thomas has a follow-up meeting with the board, and the pressure will be even greater after yesterday's unpleasantness." Emma nodded, already steeling herself for what lay ahead. "What can I do to help?" "Keep him focused," Margot replied. "And keep Victor's name out of the conversation. He doesn't need the distraction." When Emma entered the living room, Thomas was by the window again, his wheelchair angled toward the garden. His posture was rigid, his fingers tapping impatiently on the armrest. He didn't look up as she approached. "Good morning, Mr. Wheeler," Emma greeted, keeping her tone steady. "I doubt it will be," he muttered, his eyes fixed on the frost-covered hedges. Emma hesitated before stepping closer. "You have a chance today to remind the board why they trusted you in the first place." Thomas turned sharply, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. "And what if they've already decided I'm no longer fit to lead? What then?" "Then you remind them," Emma said firmly. "You've built this company. You've faced setbacks before. This isn't the end." For a moment, Thomas didn't respond. Then he gave a slight nod, his expression softening just enough to show that her words had reached him. By midday, the virtual meeting was in full swing. Emma stood discreetly by the side of the room, ready to assist if needed. On the screen, Victor was already in his element, presenting a polished report filled with thinly veiled critiques of Thomas's leadership. His words were smooth, his tone measured, but the implication was clear. Thomas's time at the helm should come to an end. Thomas listened in silence, his face an unreadable mask. When Victor finished, the room fell quiet, the tension palpable. Then Thomas spoke, his voice calm but edged with steel. "I appreciate your concerns, Victor," he began, his gaze steady. "But let's not forget the numbers. This company has thrived under my leadership, even after the accident. I've continued to oversee key decisions, and the results speak for themselves." Victor's smile was thin, almost predatory. "No one is denying your past contributions, Thomas. But the future requires someone who can adapt to new challenges, someone with the energy and perspective to move forward." Thomas's jaw tightened, but he didn't rise to the bait. "Energy and perspective are valuable, yes, but experience and vision are irreplaceable. And those, Victor, are qualities I still bring to the table." Emma felt a surge of pride as she watched Thomas hold his ground. Despite the tension, he spoke with authority, his words measured and precise. When the meeting concluded, it was clear that while Victor had made his point, Thomas had left a stronger impression. Later that afternoon, Emma found Thomas in the study, going through a stack of documents. His focus was intense, his movements deliberate. Emma approached cautiously, carrying a tray with tea and biscuits. "Tea," she offered, setting the tray down on the table beside him. He glanced up briefly. "Thank you," Emma hesitated, then said, "You handled the meeting well." Thomas sighed, leaning back in his wheelchair. "Did I? It feels like I'm constantly on the defensive, proving myself over and over again." "You're still here," Emma said softly, "and that's more than Victor can take credit for." A faint smile tugged at the corner of Thomas's lips. "You have a way of making things sound simpler than they are, Miss Stanton." "Maybe they are simpler," she replied. "You're stronger than you think, and you have people who believe in you." Thomas looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You included?" Emma met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes." As the day drew to a close, Emma prepared to leave, but before she could step out of the room, Thomas called after her. "Miss Stanton," she turned, her hand resting on the doorframe. "Yes, Mr. Wheeler?" "Thank you," he said quietly. "For everything today." Emma smiled, her chest tightening at the sincerity in his voice. "You're welcome." That evening, as Emma rode the subway home, her thoughts swirled with the day's events. Thomas's resilience had shone through, but the fight wasn't over. Victor was a relentless adversary, and the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. When she arrived at her apartment, Jake was waiting for her, his wide smile instantly lifting her spirits. "How was work, Mama?" he asked, running to hug her. "It was a good day," she replied, pulling him close. As she tucked Jake into bed that night, Emma felt a flicker of hope. Thomas Wheeler had faced another trial, and though the battle wasn't yet won, He had proven that he still had the strength to fight, and for Emma, that was a victory worth celebrating. The Wheeler estate was quiet as Emma arrived the next morning, the weight of the previous day still heavy in the air. Thomas's confrontation with Victor had been a small victory, but the tension it created lingered like a storm cloud. As she stepped inside, Margot met her with a tired expression. "Morning," Margot greeted, handing Emma a folder. "Mr. Wheeler requested these be reviewed today." Emma glanced at the papers, financial projections and engineering blueprints. "He's throwing himself into work again." Margot sighed. "It's how he copes. Just keep an eye on him, will you?" Emma nodded, heading to the study. She found Thomas there, hunched over his desk, his wheelchair angled toward a stack of papers. His usual sharpness seemed dulled, his movements slower, more deliberate. "Good morning, Mr. Wheeler," Emma said gently. "Is it?" he replied without looking up. Emma approached the desk, setting her bag down. "You did well yesterday. The board listened to you." "Listened? Yes," Thomas said, his tone heavy. "But they don't believe in me. Not really. Victor has them wrapped around his finger." Emma frowned, searching for the right words. "You're still the head of the company. That says something." Thomas leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "For now. But Victor won't stop until he takes everything I've built." "And what about what you've rebuilt?" Emma countered. "You fought back from so much already. Why let him get to you now?" Thomas's gaze softened slightly, but the tension in his shoulders remained. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not," Emma admitted, "but that doesn't mean it isn't worth fighting for." The day passed slowly, the hours marked by an uncomfortable quiet. Thomas worked through the folder Margot had given him, his focus shifting between the financial reports and the blueprints. At one point, Emma noticed him lingering over a design, a sleek, lightweight wheelchair unlike anything she'd seen before. "Is that something you've been working on?" she asked, breaking the silence. Thomas glanced at her, then back at the blueprint. "It's an old idea, one I never finished." Emma studied the design, impressed by its detail. "It looks revolutionary." "It could have been," Thomas said, his voice tinged with regret. "But I abandoned it after the accident." "Why?" Emma asked softly. Thomas hesitated, then said, "Because it felt pointless. Why design something to help others when I couldn't even help myself?" Emma's chest tightened at his words. "But you can help others now," she said. "Maybe that's exactly what you need to remind yourself of what you're capable of." Thomas didn't respond immediately, his eyes fixed on the blueprint. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. "It's easier said than done, Miss Stanton." "I know," Emma replied, "but sometimes the hardest things are the ones that matter most." That afternoon, Margot brought more documents to the study, her expression unreadable as she set them on the desk. "These are from the legal team," she said. "You'll want to review them before the next board meeting." Thomas nodded curtly, his jaw tightening as he scanned the papers. Emma noticed the way his hand trembled slightly as he turned the pages. "Is everything okay?" she asked after Margot left. Thomas didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was laced with frustration. "Victor's making another move. He's challenging my authority as CEO, claiming I'm unfit to lead." Emma felt a surge of anger on Thomas's behalf. "He can't do that." "Oh, he can," Thomas said bitterly, "and he will. He's been waiting for this moment for years." "Then fight back," Emma urged. "Show him that you're not going anywhere." Thomas's laugh was dry, almost bitter. "You think it's that simple?" "No," Emma admitted, "but I think you're stronger than you realize, and I think Victor knows that too. That's why he's trying so hard to break you." Thomas's gaze met hers, something unspoken passing between them. For a moment, the tension seemed to ease, the weight of his burdens lessened. As evening approached, Thomas asked Emma to bring the blueprint he'd been working on. She placed it on the desk in front of him, watching as he traced the lines with a careful hand. "This was meant to be a game changer," he said quietly. "A wheelchair that's not just functional, but empowering. Lightweight, durable, customizable. It could have helped so many people." "Then finish it," Emma said simply. "Make it a reality." Thomas looked at her, his expression conflicted. "And if I fail," Emma smiled faintly, "then you try again. That's what resilience is, isn't it?" Thomas didn't respond, but the faintest glimmer of hope flickered in his eyes. That night, as Emma rode the subway home, her thoughts were heavy with the day's events. Thomas was fighting battles on every front, against Victor, against his own doubts, and against the weight of his past, but for the first time, she felt he might be willing to fight back. When she arrived home, Jake greeted her with his usual enthusiasm, his laughter a balm for her weary soul. As she tucked him into bed, she thought about Thomas's blueprint and the potential it represented. Maybe, just maybe, it was the key to unlocking the future he so desperately needed. And for Emma, that was a future worth believing in. The Wheeler estate was steeped in an oppressive quiet when Emma arrived the next morning. The winter chill outside seemed to seep into the very walls of the house, its vastness feeling colder and lonelier than usual. Margot's tight expression as she handed Emma the day's agenda confirmed what Emma already suspected. Today would not be an easy one. "Thomas has called for a private strategy session with his legal and financial teams," Margot explained. "Victor's challenge is gaining traction, and the pressure is mounting." Emma nodded, her stomach knotting. "And how is he handling it?" Margot's lips pressed into a thin line. "He's more irritable than usual. Be prepared." Emma steeled herself as she made her way to the study. She found Thomas at his desk, the blueprint for his wheelchair design spread out before him. His expression was tense, his movements sharp as he rearranged the papers scattered across the surface. "Good morning," Emma greeted cautiously. Thomas glanced up briefly, his brow furrowed. "Is it?" Emma hesitated before stepping closer. "It could be. You're meeting with your team today, right? That's a step forward." Thomas snorted softly, his eyes returning to the blueprint. "A step toward what?" "Another battle. Another opportunity for Victor to twist the knife." "Toward taking control," Emma replied firmly. "This is your company, your legacy. Don't let him take it from you." Thomas leaned back in his chair, his gaze piercing. "And if I fail?" Emma met his eyes, her voice steady. "Then you try again, but giving up isn't an option." The morning was consumed by preparations for the meeting. Emma worked alongside Thomas, organizing documents and ensuring everything was in place. She noticed how his hands trembled occasionally, the strain of the situation taking its toll, but she also saw moments of resolve, flashes of the man he had been before the accident. When the meeting began, Emma stood quietly in the corner of the room, ready to assist if needed. The screen filled with the faces of lawyers and financial advisors, each one radiating a mix of professionalism and unease. It was clear they felt the weight of Victor's challenge as much as Thomas did. The discussion was tense, the stakes painfully high. The legal team outlined the potential ramifications of Victor's claims, emphasizing the need for a clear, decisive strategy. Thomas listened in silence, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the screen. "Victor's argument hinges on your perceived incapacity," one of the lawyers said carefully. "If we can present evidence of your continued leadership and contributions to the company, we can counter his claims effectively." "And if we can't?" Thomas asked, his voice low but edged with steel. The lawyer hesitated before replying. "Then the board may decide to support his motion for new leadership." The words hung in the air like a guillotine. Emma's chest tightened as she watched Thomas process the implications. For a moment, his usually unyielding expression faltered, revealing the vulnerability beneath. After the meeting, Thomas dismissed his team and sat alone in the study, staring at the papers spread across his desk. Emma approached cautiously, unsure if he wanted company. "That was a lot to take in," she said softly. Thomas didn't look at her. "It's not the first time I've faced betrayal, Miss Stanton. But somehow, it never gets easier." Emma hesitated before sitting in the chair across from him. "It's not betrayal, if you can fight back." Thomas's lips twisted into a bitter smile. "And what if I lose?" "Then you fight harder," Emma replied. "You've already come so far. Why stop now?" Thomas sighed heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. "Because it feels like everything I do just pushes me closer to the edge. No matter how hard I fight, it's never enough." Emma leaned forward, her voice firm but gentle. "You're stronger than you think, Thomas. And you're not alone in this. You have people who believe in you, people who want to help." His gaze flicked to hers, something unspoken passing between them. For a moment, the tension seemed to ease. The weight of his burdens lessened. As the afternoon wore on, Emma encouraged Thomas to step away from his work and take a break in the garden. He resisted at first, but eventually relented, allowing her to wheel him outside. The crisp winter air was bracing, the garden still and serene under a blanket of frost. "This place used to feel alive," Thomas said quietly, his eyes scanning the dormant flower beds and bare trees. "Now it just feels empty." "It's not empty," Emma replied. "It's resting. Waiting for spring." Thomas looked at her, his expression softening. "You have a way of finding hope where there is none, Miss Stanton." Emma smiled faintly. "Maybe I just see things differently." That evening, as Emma prepared to leave, Thomas called her back. "Miss Stanton," he said, his tone unusually soft. She turned and meeting his gaze. "Yes, Mr. Wheeler?" "Thank you," he said quietly, "for reminding me why I started all this in the first place." Emma's chest tightened at the sincerity in his voice. "Any time." On the subway ride home, Emma replayed the day's events in her mind. Thomas was facing an insurmountable challenge, but he wasn't facing it alone. For the first time, she felt certain that he had the strength to endure, and that her role in his life was more important than she'd ever realized. As she tucked Jake into bed that night, she thought about Thomas's quiet determination and the blueprint that still lay unfinished on his desk. It was a symbol of what could be, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, there was always the possibility of renewal, and for Emma, that was a fight worth standing by. The morning sun barely broke through the heavy grey clouds as Emma made her way to the Wheeler estate. The air was damp with the promise of snow, and her steps felt heavier than usual. Thomas had been withdrawn after the previous day's meeting, his usual sharpness replaced by a simmering frustration that Emma knew all too well. Today, however, she was determined to shift the tide. When she entered the house, Margot greeted her with a rare smile. "He's already in the study," she said, "and he's working." Emma raised an eyebrow. "That's a good sign, isn't it?" Margot's smile faded slightly. "It depends. If he's channeling his energy into something productive, then yes. If not," she trailed off, leaving the rest unsaid. Emma nodded and headed to the study. She found Thomas hunched over his desk, the blueprint for his wheelchair design front and center. Surrounding it were additional sketches and notes, many of them clearly new. His focus was intense, his pen moving rapidly across the paper. "Good morning," Emma said softly, not wanting to disturb his concentration. Thomas glanced up briefly, his expression unreadable. "You're early." "I thought I'd see how you're doing," Emma replied, stepping closer. "It looks like you've been busy." "I couldn't sleep," he admitted, leaning back in his chair, "so I decided to work." Emma studied the sketches, impressed by the level of detail. "This is incredible, Thomas. You've made real progress. It's still incomplete," he said, his tone dismissive. "Maybe," Emma agreed, "but it's closer than it was yesterday." Thomas regarded her for a moment, his eyes searching. Then he gave a small nod, as if conceding her point. "I suppose it is." The morning passed in relative quiet, the soft scratch of Thomas's pen and the rustle of papers filling the study. Emma stayed nearby, offering assistance when needed, but mostly giving him space to work. By late morning, he leaned back with a heavy sigh, his hands resting on the wheels of his chair. "I need a break," he muttered. Emma seized the opportunity. "How about some tea and maybe a walk in the garden?" Thomas hesitated, then nodded. "Fine, but just the tea." Emma prepared the tea and brought it to the sitting room, where Thomas had relocated. He sipped it slowly, his gaze distant. Emma sat nearby, waiting for him to speak. "You said something yesterday," Thomas began, his voice quiet, "about people who believe in me." Emma nodded. "I did." "Do you really mean it?" he asked, his eyes locking onto hers. "Yes," Emma replied without hesitation. "I believe in you, Thomas. I've seen what you're capable of." Thomas set his cup down, his expression thoughtful. "It's been a long time since anyone said that to me," Emma smiled faintly. "Then it's about time someone did." That afternoon, Ethan arrived for Thomas's physical therapy session. His cheerful demeanor immediately lightened the mood, and even Thomas seemed less tense as they began. "Still working on that design?" Ethan asked, as he guided Thomas through a set of stretches. Thomas grunted in response. "It's a distraction. It's more than that," Ethan said, his tone encouraging. "It's something you're passionate about. Don't downplay it." Emma, standing nearby, chimed in. "Ethan's right. That design could make a real difference, for you and for others." Thomas shot her a look, but there was no heat behind it. "You're both relentless." "Comes with the territory," Ethan replied with a grin. As the session continued, Emma noticed a subtle shift in Thomas's demeanor. He was more engaged, more willing to push himself than he had been in weeks. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. After Ethan left, Thomas returned to the study, where he stared at the blueprint for a long time. Emma, sensing he needed space, busied herself with organizing the documents on his desk. Eventually, he broke the silence. "Do you think it's good enough?" he asked, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. Emma turned to face him. "I think it's brilliant." Thomas exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Then maybe it's time to finish it." Emma's heart lifted at his words. "What do you need to make that happen?" He looked at her, his expression a mix of determination and vulnerability, support and time. "You have both," Emma said simply. "Let's make it happen." That evening, as Emma prepared to leave, Thomas stopped her at the door. "Miss Stanton," he said, his voice steady but soft. She turned, meeting his gaze. "Yes, Mr. Wheeler? I've decided to move forward with the design," he said, "and I want your help." Emma felt a surge of emotion, her throat tightening. "Of course, whatever you need." Thomas nodded, his lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile. "Thank you." On the subway ride home, Emma couldn't stop smiling. For the first time, Thomas had taken a decisive step toward reclaiming his purpose. It was a small triumph, but it felt monumental. When she arrived at her apartment, Jake greeted her with his usual exuberance. "Mama, did you have a good day?" Emma scooped him into her arms, holding him close. "I did, sweetheart. A very good day." As she tucked Jake into bed that night, Emma thought about the journey ahead. It wouldn't be easy, But for the first time, she felt confident that Thomas was ready to fight for his future, and she would be there every step of the way. The following morning, Emma arrived at the Wheeler estate with a renewed sense of determination. The air inside the house felt lighter, though the challenges ahead remained daunting. Today marked the first step toward completing Thomas's design, a project that could redefine his sense of purpose and silence the doubts that Victor had worked so hard to amplify. As she entered the study, she found Thomas already at his desk, the blueprint spread before him alongside a fresh stack of papers. His focus was razor-sharp, his pen moving swiftly across the page as he added notes and adjustments to the design. "Good morning," Emma said, setting her bag down. "Morning," Thomas replied without looking up. His tone was neutral, but carried an undercurrent of energy Emma hadn't heard in weeks. "I see you've been busy," she observed, glancing at the pages filled with detailed schematics and calculations. "Time waits for no one, Miss Stanton," Thomas said, setting his pen down and leaning back in his wheelchair. "If I'm going to do this, I intend to do it right." Emma smiled faintly. "I never doubted that." Thomas gestured to the papers. "I've refined the design, but there are still logistical challenges: manufacturing, sourcing materials, testing. It's not something I can do alone." "You don't have to," Emma said firmly. "What's the next step?" Thomas hesitated for a moment before replying. "I need to pitch the concept to investors. If I can secure funding, I can move forward." Emma's heart sank slightly at the mention of investors. She knew how grueling such meetings could be, especially with Victor lurking in the background, waiting for an opportunity to undermine Thomas's credibility. "Then we'll prepare," she said, her voice steady. "You've done the work. Now it's time to show them what you've created." Thomas regarded her with a mix of skepticism and gratitude. "You make it sound easy." "It won't be," Emma admitted. "But it'll be worth it." The rest of the morning was spent organizing the pitch. Emma helped Thomas compile a comprehensive presentation, pulling together technical details, market analysis, and potential impact statements. As they worked, she noticed how Thomas's confidence seemed to grow, his voice gaining strength as he rehearsed key points. Margot entered the study around midday, carrying a tray of tea and sandwiches. She set it down on the side table and surveyed the organized chaos on the desk. "Looks like progress," Margot remarked, her tone almost approving. "We're preparing for a pitch," Emma explained, glancing at Thomas. "He's going to present his design to investors." Margot raised an eyebrow. "Ambitious, but if anyone can pull it off, it's you, Mr. Wheeler." Thomas smirked faintly. "Let's hope you're right." Margot lingered for a moment before adding, "If you need assistance with the logistics, let me know. I still have a few contacts who owe me favors." Emma exchanged a surprised glance with Thomas, who nodded slightly. "I'll keep that in mind," he said. As the afternoon wore on, Emma noticed a subtle tension creeping into Thomas's posture. His hands fidgeted with the edge of the blueprint, and his voice grew sharper as he discussed potential questions investors might ask. "What if they don't take me seriously?" Thomas said suddenly, breaking the rhythm of their discussion. "What if they see me as a liability?" Emma paused, setting down the document she was reviewing. "They won't." Thomas shot her a skeptical look. "You can't know that." "No," Emma admitted. "But I do know that you're brilliant, Thomas. This design is proof of that, and anyone who doesn't see it is a fool." His expression softened slightly, but the doubt in his eyes remained. "It's easy for you to say that. You don't have to sit in front of a room full of people and prove your worth." Emma hesitated before replying, her voice quiet but firm. "I know what it's like to feel underestimated, to feel like the odds are stacked against you, but I also know that you're stronger than you think." You've already overcome so much. This is just one more step. Thomas regarded her for a long moment before nodding. You're annoyingly persistent, Miss Stanton. It's part of the job, she replied with a small smile. By early evening, the pitch was nearly complete. Thomas had rehearsed his key points several times, each run-through more confident than the last. Emma watched him with a mix of pride and relief, knowing how far he'd come since she first arrived at the estate. As she prepared to leave for the day, Thomas called out to her, "Miss Stanton." She turned, pausing in the doorway. "Yes?" "Thank you," he said, his voice steady but quiet. "For everything. I couldn't have done this without you." Emma felt her throat tighten, her chest swelling with emotion. "You don't have to thank me, Thomas. You're the one doing the work." He shook his head slightly, a faint smile playing at his lips. "Even so, it means something." Emma nodded, her voice too thick with emotion to reply. She left the study, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. On the subway ride home, Emma reflected on the day's progress. Thomas was stepping into uncharted territory, but he wasn't doing it alone. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, she felt confident that he had the strength and support to face it. When she arrived home, Jake greeted her with his usual enthusiasm, his laughter filling the small apartment. As she tucked him into bed that night, Emma thought about the blueprint on Thomas's desk and the possibilities it represented. It wasn't just a design, it was a symbol of resilience, of hope, and of a future worth fighting for. And Emma would be there, every step of the way. The Wheeler estate was alive with activity the next morning. Emma arrived early, her breath visible in the chilly air as she hurried inside. She could feel the tension radiating through the house. Today was the day Thomas would pitch his design to a group of potential investors. It was the culmination of weeks of preparation, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. Margot met her at the door, clipboard in hand. "They'll be arriving at noon," she informed Emma. "Mr. Wheeler is in the study, rehearsing." Emma nodded, shedding her coat and heading straight to the study. She found Thomas pacing near the window, his wheelchair pushed aside for now. His usual stoicism was tinged with nervous energy, his hands fidgeting with the edge of a note card. "Good morning," Emma said softly, not wanting to startle him. Thomas turned, his expression tight but focused. "Morning. You're early." "I thought I'd see if you needed anything," she replied, stepping closer. "How are you feeling?" "Prepared," he said curtly, then sighed. "And completely unprepared. Does that make sense?" Emma smiled faintly. "It does. But you've got this, Thomas. You've put in the work." He nodded, though the tension in his jaw didn't ease. "Let's hope that's enough." The hours leading up to the pitch passed in a blur. Emma helped Thomas with last-minute adjustments to his presentation, ensuring that every slide, every note was polished to perfection. Margot coordinated the logistics, her efficiency keeping the proceedings on track. As noon approached, the first of the investors arrived. Emma watched from the sidelines as they filed into the conference room, men and women in tailored suits, their expressions sharp and unreadable. Victor was among them, his presence an unwelcome but expected addition. He greeted Thomas with a thin smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "Thomas," Victor said smoothly, "looking forward to hearing what you've prepared." Thomas's reply was cool and measured. "Let's get started." The pitch began with Thomas seated at the head of the table, his presentation projected onto a large screen behind him. He spoke with clarity and conviction, walking the investors through the design's features, potential market impact, and the broader implications for accessibility. His voice carried a quiet authority, the product of years of leadership and expertise. Emma watched from the back of the room, her heart pounding with every word. She could see the investors exchanging glances, their expressions shifting from skepticism to interest as Thomas's presentation unfolded. Even Victor, who had positioned himself as the primary antagonist, seemed momentarily disarmed. When Thomas finished, the room was silent for a beat before the questions began. The investors probed into the details of the design, the feasibility of production, and the financial projections. Thomas answered each question with precision, his composure unshaken. But then Victor spoke up, his tone cutting through the room like a blade. "Thomas, this is all very impressive. But given your condition, how can the board trust that you'll see this project through to completion?" The room tensed. Emma's breath caught as she saw Thomas's jaw tighten. The question was a thinly veiled attack, one designed to undermine his authority and credibility. Thomas took a deep breath, his gaze steady. "My condition hasn't stopped me from leading this company, and it won't stop me from completing this project. What matters is the work, not my personal circumstances." Victor's smile was sharp, almost predatory. "And if the work becomes too much, what then?" Emma's hands clenched into fists, her frustration building as she watched Victor try to tear Thomas down. But then Thomas did something unexpected. He smiled, just slightly, but enough to disarm the tension. "Then I'll do what I've always done," he said calmly. "I'll adapt." The meeting concluded with polite applause, the investors leaving the room in pairs and small groups. Victor lingered, his gaze lingering on Thomas as he exited without another word. As the door closed behind the last of the investors, Thomas let out a long breath, leaning back in his wheelchair. Emma stepped forward, her heart still pounding from the tension of the meeting. "You handled that perfectly," she said, her voice filled with admiration. Thomas shook his head. "I don't know. It's hard to tell what they're thinking." "They were impressed," Margot said, joining them. "I've seen enough of these meetings to know they wouldn't have stayed as long as they did if they weren't interested." Thomas nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "We'll see." That evening, as Emma prepared to leave, she found Thomas in the study, staring at the blueprint that had been at the center of the day's pitch. His expression was contemplative, his fingers tracing the edges of the design. "Miss Stanton," he said without looking up. "Yes," Emma replied, pausing in the doorway. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything. I wouldn't have made it this far without you." Emma felt her throat tighten, her chest swelling with emotion. "You did the work, Thomas. I just reminded you of what you're capable of." He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. And that made all the difference. On the subway ride home, Emma replayed the events of the day in her mind. Thomas had faced the crucible and emerged stronger, his determination unshaken despite Victor's attempts to undermine him. For the first time, she felt that the future he was fighting for was within reach. When she arrived home, Jake greeted her with his usual enthusiasm, his laughter a reminder of why she had taken this job in the first place. As she tucked him into bed, she thought about the journey ahead. It wouldn't be easy, but it was worth it, and she would be there every step of the way. The morning after the investor pitch, the Wheeler estate was unusually still. The tension that had dominated the previous day lingered in the air, but it was softened by a sense of accomplishment. For the first time in months, there was a flicker of hope, a tangible step toward progress. Emma arrived early, her thoughts still on the pitch and how masterfully Thomas had handled himself. She couldn't help but feel proud of him, though she knew the journey was far from over. Inside, Margot greeted her with a rare smile. "Good morning," Margot said, handing Emma the day's agenda. "Mr. Wheeler's been in the study since dawn. He seems lighter." Emma raised an eyebrow. "That's good, right?" Margot nodded. "It's a start." Emma made her way to the study, where she found Thomas seated at his desk. The blueprint that had been the centerpiece of his pitch lay neatly rolled up, and a fresh stack of papers occupied the space in front of him. His expression was contemplative as he sipped his coffee, the tension in his shoulders noticeably eased. "Good morning," Emma said softly. Thomas looked up, his lips curving into a faint smile. "Morning? You're up early," Emma observed, setting her bag down. "There's work to be done," he replied, gesturing to the papers. The investors requested additional information, production timelines, cost breakdowns, projected impact. They want details. "That's a good sign," Emma said, her heart lifting. "It means they're interested." "It means they're scrutinizing," Thomas corrected, though his tone lacked its usual edge. "But yes, it's progress." Emma took a seat across from him. "How can I help?" Thomas handed her a folder filled with documents. "Start with these. Margot's pulling data from the company archives, but we'll need to organize it for the follow-up presentation." Emma nodded, diving into the task. They worked in companionable silence, the room filled only with the sound of papers shuffling and pens scratching. It was a far cry from the tension of earlier weeks, and Emma found herself marveling at how much Thomas had changed since she first arrived. By mid-morning, Margot joined them in the study, her hands full of additional reports. "This should cover most of what the investors asked for," she said, setting the stack on the desk. Thomas flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing slightly. "It's thorough, almost too thorough," Margot smirked. "Better to give them too much than not enough." Thomas nodded, his expression softening. "Thank you, Margot." Margot blinked, clearly caught off guard by the gratitude. "Of course," she replied, her voice softer than usual. Emma exchanged a glance with Margot, both of them silently acknowledging the significance of Thomas's gesture. It wasn't much, but it was another step forward. After Margot left, Thomas leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the window. "Do you think they'll say yes?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. Emma hesitated before answering. "I think you've given them every reason to." Thomas sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "And if they don't?" "Then we'll find another way," Emma said firmly. "You didn't come this far to stop now." Thomas glanced at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "You always know what to say, don't you?" Emma smiled faintly. "Not always." "But I mean it, Thomas. You're not in this alone." He didn't respond, but the slight relaxation in his posture told her that her words had reached him. Later that afternoon, Ethan stopped by for Thomas's physical therapy session. His cheerful demeanor immediately lightened the mood, and even Thomas seemed more at ease. "How's our resident inventor doing today?" Ethan asked as he guided Thomas through a set of stretches. "Busy," Thomas replied, his tone less curt than usual. "The investors want more information." "That's a good thing," Ethan said, grinning. "Means they're taking you seriously." Thomas gave a non-committal shrug, but Emma could see the faint trace of satisfaction in his expression. As the session continued, Ethan shot Emma a knowing look. "You've been good for him," he said quietly, his voice just low enough for her to hear. Emma smiled. "He's been good for himself." "I just remind him of that." As evening fell, Emma prepared to leave, but before she could step out, Thomas called her back. "Miss Stanton." She turned, pausing in the doorway. "Yes?" "I wanted to say—" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "Thank you for believing in me. I don't think I've said it enough." Emma felt her throat tighten, her chest swelling with emotion. "You don't have to thank me, Thomas. You've earned this." His lips curved into the faintest smile. "Still, it means something." Emma nodded, her voice too thick with emotion to reply. She left the study, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. On the subway ride home, Emma replayed the day's events in her mind. The aftermath of the pitch had brought new challenges, but it had also brought hope. Thomas was on the cusp of something extraordinary, and for the first time, she felt certain he would see it through. When she arrived home, Jake greeted her with his usual enthusiasm, his laughter filling the small apartment. As she tucked him into bed that night, Emma thought about the journey ahead. It wouldn't be easy, but it was worth it, and she would be there, every step of the way. The morning sun broke through the frost-laden windows of the Wheeler estate, casting a golden hue over the study where Thomas and Emma worked in tandem. The house, once steeped in tension, now hummed with quiet purpose. It was the kind of calm that only came after the storm, though both knew there were more challenges ahead. Emma arrived to find Thomas already at his desk, sifting through a fresh stack of investor correspondence. His focus was unyielding, his movements deliberate. The blueprint that had once been a symbol of his frustration and doubt now represented something far greater: hope, purpose, and the possibility of a second chance. "Good morning," Emma greeted as she set her bag down. "Morning," Thomas replied, not looking up. His tone was neutral but carried an undercurrent of energy. "How's it going?" Emma asked, moving closer. "They've sent follow-up questions," Thomas said, gesturing to the papers. "Detailed ones. It's a good sign, but it means more work." "Then we'd better get started," Emma said with a small smile. Thomas glanced at her, his lips twitching in what might have been an almost smile. "You're tireless, Miss Stanton." "It's part of the job," she replied. They spent the morning crafting responses to the investors' inquiries. Each question was an opportunity for Thomas to showcase his expertise, and Emma could see how much the process reinvigorated him. He spoke with clarity and passion, his words no longer tinged with the bitterness that had once dominated their conversations. As they worked, Emma noticed a subtle shift in Thomas's demeanor. His movements were steadier, his voice more confident. He still had his moments of doubt, hesitations that Emma recognized as the scars of his past, but they no longer defined him. He was beginning to reclaim the man he had been before the accident, piece by piece. By mid-morning, Margot entered the study with a tray of tea and biscuits. "You've been at it for hours," she said, setting the tray down. "Take a break." Thomas gave her a pointed look. "We don't have time for breaks." Margot raised an eyebrow. "You'll think more clearly with tea in your system," Emma chuckled softly. "She's not wrong." Thomas sighed but relented, taking a cup of tea and sipping it thoughtfully. Margot lingered for a moment, her expression softening as she looked at him. "You're doing well," she said quietly. Thomas glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "We'll see." Margot didn't press further, but as she left the room, Emma caught a glimpse of pride in her eyes. That afternoon, Ethan arrived for Thomas's physical therapy session. His presence, as always, brought a sense of levity to the house. He greeted Thomas with his usual cheerful demeanor, though there was a note of seriousness beneath his words. "I hear you've been making waves with this project of yours," Ethan said, as he guided Thomas through a series of stretches. "Rumors travel fast," Thomas replied dryly. Ethan grinned. "It's not just rumors. Margot told me the investors are asking for more details. That's a big deal." "It's progress," Thomas admitted, his tone cautious. "It's more than that," Ethan countered. "It's you proving everyone wrong." Thomas didn't respond, but the faintest hint of satisfaction crossed his face. As the session continued, Emma noticed how much stronger Thomas seemed, not just physically, but emotionally. His resilience, once buried beneath layers of grief and anger, was beginning to shine through. It was a transformation she had hoped for but hadn't dared to expect. Later that evening, Emma found herself alone with Thomas in the study. The day's work was done, but neither seemed ready to call it a night. Thomas sat by the window, The blueprint spread across his lap, his gaze distant. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" he asked suddenly, his voice quiet. Emma hesitated, then said, "I think about it all the time. For you, for Jake, even for me." Thomas turned to look at her. "And what do you see?" Emma smiled faintly. "I see possibility. For all of us." Thomas's lips curved into the faintest smile. "You're an optimist, Miss Stanton." "Someone has to be," she replied. "But it's not just optimism, Thomas. It's faith. I believe in you." His gaze softened, and for a moment the walls he had so carefully constructed seemed to fade. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "for everything." "You don't have to thank me," Emma said gently. "This is all you." Thomas shook his head slightly. "No, it's us." On the subway ride home, Emma replayed the conversation in her mind. Thomas Wheeler, the man who had once been defined by his grief and bitterness, was beginning to heal. It wasn't a sudden transformation. He still had his struggles, his doubts, but he was no longer letting them define him. When Emma arrived home, Jake greeted her with his usual enthusiasm, his laughter filling the small apartment. As she tucked him into bed that night, she thought about Thomas's quiet transformation and the journey that lay ahead. It wouldn't be easy, but it was worth it, because sometimes the hardest battles were the ones that mattered most. The Wheeler estate buzzed with a quiet but palpable energy the next morning. Emma arrived to find the staff moving with a sense of purpose, Margot coordinating tasks with her usual efficiency. The investors' response to Thomas's follow-up presentation had been encouraging, but the real challenge was yet to come, finalizing the agreement and securing funding. Thomas had requested a meeting with his core team, including Margot and Ethan, to review every detail. Emma had been invited to sit in, a gesture that didn't escape her notice. It was a sign of how much Thomas valued her insight and her unwavering support. When she entered the study, she found Thomas at the head of the table, his wheelchair angled to face the group. Margot was already there, reviewing documents, while Ethan leaned against the wall, his easy smile providing a counterpoint to the tension in the room. "Miss Stanton," Thomas greeted as she took her seat. His tone was calm, but carried an edge of determination. "We have a lot to cover." "Let's get to it," Emma replied, setting her notebook on the table. The meeting began with a review of the investors' latest requests. Margot summarized the feedback, her voice steady as she outlined the questions that still needed answers. Thomas listened intently, his gaze sharp as he made notes. "They want more specifics on the production timeline," Margot said, handing a document to Thomas. "And they've asked for additional data on potential market competition." Thomas frowned, his pen pausing mid-note. "We've already provided projections." "How much more do they want?" "They're being thorough," Margot replied. "It's not unusual at this stage." Thomas leaned back, his jaw tightening. "Thorough or not, they're dragging their feet." Ethan spoke up, his tone light but firm. "They're testing you, Thomas. They want to see if you're willing to fight for this." Thomas's eyes narrowed, but he didn't argue. Instead, he turned to Emma. "What do you think?" Emma hesitated, then said, "I think Ethan's right. This is about proving that you're committed. If they see how much this means to you, they'll follow through." Thomas considered her words, then nodded. "Fine. We'll give them what they want." The rest of the meeting was a flurry of activity. Margot coordinated with the company's legal team to prepare additional documents, while Ethan suggested strategies for addressing potential investor concerns. Emma worked closely with Thomas to refine his presentation, ensuring that every detail was accounted for. As they worked, Emma noticed how Thomas seemed to draw strength from the people around him. He still carried the weight of his responsibilities, but he was no longer bearing it alone. The team's support had become his foundation, and Emma couldn't help but feel proud of how far he'd come. By early afternoon, the meeting adjourned, and the team dispersed to tackle their respective tasks. Emma stayed behind, helping Thomas organize the materials for his final presentation. "Do you think it will be enough?" Thomas asked as he sorted through the papers. Emma met his gaze. "I do, and so do they." Thomas's lips twitched in a faint smile. "You're sure of that?" "Yes," Emma replied without hesitation, "because you've shown them who you are. And that's enough." Later that day, Thomas requested a moment alone with Emma. She found him in the library, seated near the window, where the winter light cast long shadows across the room. In his hands was the blueprint that had started it all, the edges worn from countless revisions. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice quiet, "about why I started this project." Emma took a seat across from him. And I realized it wasn't just about proving something to the investors," he continued. "It was about proving something to myself, that I'm still capable, that I still have something to offer." "You've more than proven that," Emma said softly, "not just to yourself, but to everyone around you." Thomas's gaze drifted to the blueprint. "It's strange. For so long, I thought my life was over. But now," he trailed off, his voice thick with emotion, "now I feel like I'm finally starting to live again." Emma felt her throat tighten, her chest swelling with pride and relief. "You are," she said simply, "and it's just the beginning." As evening fell, Emma prepared to leave, but Thomas stopped her at the door. "Miss Stanton," he said, his voice steady but soft. She turned, meeting his gaze. "Yes? I don't say this often," he began, his tone uncharacteristically vulnerable. "But thank you for believing in me when I couldn't." Emma felt a lump rise in her throat. "You didn't need me to believe in you, Thomas. You just needed to see what was already there." His lips curved into the faintest smile. "Perhaps, but I wouldn't have gotten here without you." Emma nodded, her voice too thick with emotion to reply. She left the estate, her heart full of hope and anticipation for what was to come. On the subway ride home, Emma replayed the day's events in her mind. Thomas was poised for the final push, his determination and resilience shining brighter than ever. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time, it felt within reach. When she arrived home, Jake greeted her with his usual enthusiasm, his laughter filling the small apartment. As she tucked him into bed that night, Emma thought about Thomas's journey and the strength he had found within himself. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that the best was yet to come. The Wheeler estate was unusually quiet the next morning. The final investor meeting loomed, and the weight of its significance was palpable. Thomas had spent the evening refining his presentation one last time, his determination unwavering. Now, as the hours ticked by, the anticipation grew. Emma arrived early, greeted by Margot's characteristic efficiency. "Today's the day," Margot said simply, handing Emma a revised schedule. "Investors are scheduled for 11. Everything is ready." Emma nodded, her own nerves mirroring the tension she saw in Margot's face. "And Thomas?" "In the study," Margot replied. "He's calm, focused." Emma made her way to the study, finding Thomas seated at his desk. The blueprint and accompanying materials were neatly arranged before him. He glanced up as she entered, offering a faint smile. "Good morning, Miss Stanton," he said, his tone steady. "Good morning," Emma replied, setting her bag down. "How are you feeling?" "Ready," Thomas said simply, "for whatever comes." Emma studied him for a moment, noting the quiet confidence in his posture. "You've got this," she said softly. Thomas nodded. "Let's hope they think so." The investors arrived promptly at 11, their sharp suits and polished demeanor a reminder of the high stakes. Emma watched from the back of the room. As they took their seats, their expressions guarded but curious. Victor was among them, his presence a cold reminder of the obstacles Thomas still faced. Thomas began his presentation with a calm authority that immediately commanded the room. He spoke of the challenges he had faced, the vision behind his design, and the potential impact it could have on countless lives. His voice was steady, his words measured, and his passion unmistakable. Emma watched as the investors leaned in, their initial skepticism giving way to interest. Even Victor, seated near the center, seemed momentarily disarmed. When Thomas finished, the room was silent for a beat before the questions began. The investors probed into the details, challenging assumptions and exploring potential risks. Thomas met each question with precision, his responses thoughtful and thorough. But then Victor spoke, his tone sharp and calculated. "This is all very impressive, Thomas," he said, his words dripping with condescension. "But given your condition, how can the board trust that you'll see this project through?" The room tensed, all eyes turning to Thomas. Emma held her breath, her hands clenched at her sides. Thomas didn't flinch. Instead, he met Victor's gaze head-on. "My condition has never defined my abilities," he said firmly. "What defines me is my determination and my vision. This project isn't about proving anything to you, Victor, or anyone else. It's about creating something that matters." Victor opened his mouth to reply, but one of the investors cut him off. "I think we've heard enough," she said, her tone decisive. "Thomas, thank you for your presentation. We'll deliberate and inform you of our decisions soon." The meeting concluded with polite handshakes and muted exchanges. The investors left the room one by one, their expressions unreadable. Victor lingered for a moment, his gaze lingering on Thomas before he too departed. The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing slightly as the tension drained from the room. Emma stepped forward, her heart still pounding. "You were incredible," she said softly. Thomas gave her a faint smile. "We'll see what they think." Margot entered the room, her expression calm but watchful. "That was one of the best pitches I've seen," she said simply. "If they don't see it, they're fools." Thomas nodded, though his gaze remained distant. "Now we wait." The hours that followed were agonizing. Thomas retreated to the study, immersing himself in work to distract from the uncertainty. Emma stayed close, ready to offer support if needed. The atmosphere in the house was heavy with anticipation, each passing minute stretching into an eternity. Finally, as the afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky, the call came. Margot answered, her expression giving nothing away as she listened intently. When she hung up, she turned to Thomas and Emma, her lips curving into a small smile. "They're in," she said simply. "The funding is approved." Emma let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her chest swelling with relief. Thomas closed his eyes briefly, a faint smile breaking across his face. "It's done," he said quietly, his voice filled with a mix of exhaustion and triumph. Margot nodded. "It's just the beginning, Thomas, but you've done it." That evening, as Emma prepared to leave, she found Thomas in the study, staring out the window. The blueprint was still on his desk, now a symbol of what he had achieved. "You did it," Emma said softly, stepping into the room. Thomas turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "We did it." Emma smiled. "What happens next?" Thomas's lips curved into a faint smile. "We build." On the subway ride home, Emma felt a profound sense of accomplishment. Thomas had faced his greatest challenge and emerged victorious, his determination and resilience shining brighter than ever. It was a moment of triumph, but it was also a beginning, a step toward a future that was brighter than either of them had dared to hope. When she arrived home, Jake greeted her with his usual exuberance, his laughter filling the small apartment. As she tucked him into bed that night, Emma thought about Thomas's journey and the strength it had taken to reach this point. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that the best was yet to come. The days that followed the investor meeting were marked by a flurry of activity. The Wheeler estate, once steeped in tension and quiet despair, now hummed with the energy of new beginnings. The investors' approval had not only secured funding, but also ignited a sense of purpose in Thomas that was palpable in every corner of the house. Emma arrived each morning to find Thomas already at work, his focus sharper than ever. The blueprint that had once been a symbol of his doubts was now the foundation of a project that promised to change lives, not just his own, but those of countless others. "Good morning," Emma greeted as she stepped into the study one crisp winter morning. Thomas glanced up from his desk, offering a faint but genuine smile. "Morning, Miss Stanton." "You seem busy," Emma observed, noting the stack of documents and schematics spread before him. "Busy is an understatement," Thomas replied, his tone carrying a hint of amusement. "The investors want updates, the production team has questions, and the legal department is working overtime." Emma raised an eyebrow. "And how are you handling all of that?" Thomas leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Surprisingly well. It's invigorating in a way, having something to fight for again." Emma smiled. "It suits you." By mid-morning, the study became a hub of activity as Margot and members of the production team joined Thomas to review plans and timelines. Emma stayed close, taking notes and offering assistance where needed. The atmosphere was collaborative, almost hopeful, a stark contrast to the somber days that had once defined the estate. Ethan arrived in the afternoon for Thomas's therapy session, his usual energy lifting the mood even further. "I hear the wheels are in motion," he said with a grin as he guided Thomas through a series of exercises. "They are," Thomas replied, his voice steady. "It's a long road, but we're moving forward." Ethan glanced at Emma, his expression conspiratorial. "This one's been good for you," he said to Thomas, nodding in her direction. Thomas smirked faintly. "She has her moments." Emma rolled her eyes, but her smile betrayed her amusement. "I'll take that as a compliment." As the session continued, Emma couldn't help but marvel at the transformation in Thomas. He was still guarded at times, his wounds far from fully healed, but there was a lightness to him now, a sense of possibility that hadn't been there before. Later that evening, as the house quieted and the day's work wound down, Emma found Thomas in the library. He was seated near the window, the blueprint folded neatly on the table beside him. The fading sunlight cast a warm glow over the room, highlighting the contemplative expression on his face. "Do you ever think about how far you've come?" Emma asked, breaking the silence as she stepped inside. Thomas looked up, his gaze softening. "I do. More often than I'd like to admit. And," she prompted, taking a seat across from him. "And it's strange," he admitted. "For so long, I thought my life was over. That everything I'd built, everything I cared about, was gone. But now I see that there's more." Emma nodded, her chest tightening with emotion. "There is, and you've earned every bit of it." Thomas's lips curved into a faint smile. "You make it sound so simple." "It's not," Emma said softly, "but it's worth it." For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the weight of their journey hanging between them. Then Thomas reached for the blueprint, his fingers tracing the lines with a reverence that spoke volumes. "This," he said quietly, "is just the beginning." When Emma left the estate that night, the air was cold but invigorating, each breath a reminder of the progress they had made. On the subway ride home, she thought about Thomas's transformation, The man who had once been defined by his grief and bitterness, now standing at the threshold of a new chapter. Jake was waiting for her when she arrived, his excitement filling the small apartment. "Mama, did Mr. Wheeler finish his invention yet?" "Not yet," Emma replied, scooping him into her arms. "But he's getting closer." Jake grinned. "You're helping him, right?" Emma smiled, her chest swelling with pride. "I am." As she tucked Jake into bed that night, Emma reflected on her own journey. What had started as a desperate attempt to make ends meet had become something far greater, a chance to make a difference, to be part of a story of resilience and redemption. And as she closed her eyes, she knew, with absolute certainty, that the best was still to come. The first signs of spring had begun to show at the Wheeler estate, the frost melting into soft patches of green. The garden, once dormant and lifeless, was slowly waking up, much like the man who owned it. Inside the estate, the energy had shifted entirely. Gone was the oppressive weight of despair, replaced with the hum of progress. Emma arrived early, greeted by Margot's usual nod. "Good timing," Margot said, handing Emma a new folder. "These are the latest reports from the production team. Mr. Wheeler's already in the study." Emma took the folder and made her way to the study, where she found Thomas poring over a set of schematics. His focus was sharp, his movements deliberate, but there was an ease to him now that hadn't existed before. He looked up as she entered, offering a faint smile. "Good morning, Miss Stanton," he said. "Good morning," Emma replied, setting the folder on his desk. "How are things coming along?" "Better than expected," Thomas said, flipping through the folder. "The prototypes are nearly complete. The production team thinks we'll have something to test within the month." Emma's eyebrows lifted. "That's incredible." "It's progress," Thomas said, though his tone carried a note of pride. "But there's still work to be done." The morning passed in a blur of activity. Emma assisted Thomas in reviewing reports, organizing feedback from the production team, and preparing updates for the investors. Each task felt purposeful, a step closer to realizing the vision they had worked so hard to create. By mid-morning, Ethan arrived, his cheerful demeanor as infectious as ever. "I hear things are moving quickly," he said, as he helped Thomas into position for his physical therapy session. "They are," Thomas replied. "Too quickly, some might say." "Not a bad problem to have," Ethan said with a grin. "And how are you holding up?" Thomas hesitated, then said, "Better than I expected." Ethan shot a knowing glance at Emma. "That's because you've got the best support system around." Thomas smirked. "I suppose I do." The therapy session continued with the usual rhythm, but there was an underlying lightness to the atmosphere. Thomas pushed himself harder, his movements more confident, his determination unshakable. It was a far cry from the man who had once resisted even the smallest effort. That afternoon, the prototypes arrived. The production team brought them to the estate, setting up a demonstration in one of the larger rooms. Emma stood beside Thomas as the engineers unveiled the first finished model, a sleek, lightweight wheelchair that was both functional and elegant. Thomas's expression was unreadable as he wheeled closer to inspect it. He ran his hands over the frame, his fingers tracing the lines of the design he had brought to life. "It's exactly as I envisioned," he said quietly, his voice tinged with awe. "It's more than that," one of the engineers said. "This is going to change lives, Thomas." Emma watched as a rare smile spread across Thomas's face. It was a moment of triumph, not just for the project, but for the man who had fought so hard to reclaim his purpose. The rest of the day was spent testing the prototype. Thomas insisted on being the first to try it, his movements careful but steady as he maneuvered the chair through the estate. The design worked seamlessly, its lightweight frame and responsive controls a testament to the thought and effort that had gone into its creation. Emma watched with a mix of pride and emotion. her heart swelling as Thomas's confidence grew with each turn of the wheels. When he returned to the group, his expression was lighter than she had ever seen it. "It works," he said simply. "It actually works." "It's more than that," Emma said softly. "It's a masterpiece." Thomas glanced at her, his gaze lingering. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Emma smiled. "We have, and it's just the beginning." As the evening settled in, the team began to disperse, leaving Thomas and Emma alone in the study. The blueprint that had once seemed like an impossible dream now rested beside the finished prototype, a symbol of how far they had come. "Do you ever think about what this means?" Thomas asked, breaking the silence. Emma tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "This," Thomas said, gesturing to the prototype. "The lives it could change, the doors it could open, for others and for me." Emma nodded, her voice soft. "It means everything, Thomas. Not just for the people who will use it, but for you. You've proven that you're more than your circumstances. You're a builder, a creator. And you've reminded everyone, including yourself, what you're capable of." Thomas looked at her, his expression unreadable. "And you've been here every step of the way. I don't know if I could have done it without you." "You could have," Emma said gently. "But I'm glad I could help." On the subway ride home, Emma felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The ripple effect of Thomas's work was just beginning, but already it was clear that this project was more than a product. It was a testament to resilience, creativity, and the power of belief. When she arrived home, Jake greeted her with his usual enthusiasm, his laughter filling the small apartment. As she tucked him into bed that night, Emma thought about the journey she and Thomas had shared. It had been long and challenging, but it had also been transformative, and as she closed her eyes, she knew the best was yet to come for both of them. The Wheeler estate felt alive with a sense of triumph as the first production prototypes were unveiled to a small but influential audience. The day had been carefully orchestrated by Margot, who had arranged for investors, industry experts, and a select group of media representatives to attend. For Thomas, this was more than a presentation. It was a culmination of months of struggle, resilience, and transformation. Emma arrived early, greeted by the sight of the estate in full preparation mode. Staff moved briskly, setting up displays and arranging refreshments. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation. "Big day," Margot said as she handed Emma a clipboard filled with last-minute notes. "Everything's ready. Let's hope it goes smoothly." "It will," Emma replied confidently. "Thomas is ready." Margot nodded, her expression softening. "Thanks to you." Emma smiled faintly but didn't reply. Instead, she made her way to the study, where Thomas was rehearsing his remarks. He looked up as she entered, his face a mix of focus and determination. "Morning, Miss Stanton," he greeted, his tone calm but steady. "Morning," Emma replied, setting the clipboard on the desk. "How are you feeling?" "Prepared," Thomas said simply, "and oddly optimistic." Emma's lips twitched into a smile. "That's a good look on you." As the event began, Thomas wheeled into the main hall, his presence commanding yet understated. The prototype was the centerpiece of the room, displayed on a sleek podium with accompanying visuals highlighting its features and potential impact. Conversations hushed as Thomas began his presentation, his voice steady and filled with conviction. "For far too long," he began, "mobility devices have been viewed as functional, but uninspired. This project isn't just about creating something practical, it's about empowering people to live fully, without compromise." Emma watched from the sidelines, her chest swelling with pride. Thomas spoke with clarity and passion, his words resonating with the audience. He shared the story behind the design, the challenges he had faced, the vision that had driven him, and the people who had supported him along the way. When he finished, the room erupted into applause. Emma caught the glances exchanged among the investors and industry experts, their expressions a mix of admiration and approval. Even Victor, standing near the back of the room, seemed momentarily silenced. The rest of the event was a whirlwind of conversations and demonstrations. Attendees took turns testing the prototype, their reactions overwhelmingly positive. Thomas remained at the center of it all, answering questions and engaging with the guests in a way that felt both natural and genuine. Emma stayed close, assisting where needed, but mostly observing the transformation that had taken place. The man who had once hidden behind walls of grief and anger was now leading with purpose and confidence. It was a moment she knew she would carry with her for the rest of her life. By early evening, the crowd began to thin, leaving Thomas and Emma alone in the main hall. The prototype still stood on its podium, a symbol of what they had achieved. "You were amazing today," Emma said softly, stepping closer. Thomas looked at her, his expression a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction. "It wasn't just me. This was a team effort." Emma smiled. "Maybe, but you were the one who made it happen." Thomas's gaze softened. "I couldn't have done it without you, Miss Stanton. You reminded me of who I could be." "And you reminded me of what's possible," Emma replied, her voice thick with emotion. Later that evening, as the house quieted and the guests departed, Thomas and Emma retreated to the study. The blueprint that had started it all lay on the desk, a reminder of how far they had come. "What now?" Emma asked, breaking the silence. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "Now we take this further. There's more to do, more designs, more innovations. This is just the beginning." Emma nodded, her chest swelling with pride. "You've built something incredible, Thomas, and it's only going to grow." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You're a part of that, you know. None of this would have happened without you." Emma smiled faintly. "I was just doing my job." Thomas shook his head. "It was more than that. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. That changed everything." Emma felt her throat tighten, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're the one who did the work, Thomas. I just reminded you of what was already there." His lips curved into a faint smile. And that made all the difference. On the subway ride home, Emma felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The day had been a celebration of possibility, a reminder that even the darkest moments could lead to something extraordinary. Thomas had not only reclaimed his purpose, but also inspired everyone around him, herself included. When she arrived home, Jake greeted her with his usual enthusiasm, his laughter filling the small apartment. As she tucked him into bed that night, Emma thought about the journey she and Thomas had shared. It had been one of resilience, growth, and redemption, a story that was far from over, and as she closed her eyes, she knew that the future was bright for both of them. The morning after the prototype's successful unveiling, the Wheeler estate was quiet, its usual hum of activity subdued in the wake of the previous day's triumph. Emma arrived early, as always, but this time the air carried a sense of calm, as though the house itself were taking a moment to breathe. Margot greeted her at the door with a rare smile. "You've come at the right time," she said, handing Emma a folder. "Thomas is in the garden. He asked for you." Emma blinked, surprised. "The garden?" Margot nodded. "He's been out there since sunrise." Emma took the folder and made her way through the house, stepping out into the crisp morning air. The garden, once a place of sorrow for Thomas, was now alive with the first blooms of spring. The vibrant colors seemed to mirror the transformation she had witnessed in him over the past months. She found Thomas near the stone bench under the towering oak tree, the same spot where they had shared one of their first meaningful conversations. He sat in his wheelchair, his gaze fixed on the horizon, the sunlight casting a warm glow over his face. "You're up early," Emma said, approaching with a smile. Thomas turned to her, his expression thoughtful. It seemed like a good day for reflection. Emma took a seat on the bench beside him. "What's on your mind?" Thomas was silent for a moment, his gaze drifting back to the garden. "Yesterday was more than I expected," he said finally. "Seeing their reactions, hearing their feedback, it reminded me of why I started this journey in the first place." Emma nodded, her voice soft. "It was a big day, and you handled it brilliantly." Thomas's lips curved into a faint smile. "It wasn't just about the project, though. It was about proving something to myself, that I could still be the man I was before. Everything." "You've done more than that," Emma said, her chest tightening with emotion. "You've shown everyone, including yourself, that you're stronger than ever." Thomas met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. "I couldn't have done it alone." "You didn't have to," Emma replied. "You've had a team behind you, people who believe in you. And you," Thomas said quietly, "you've been there every step of the way." The rest of the morning passed in quiet companionship. Emma stayed with Thomas in the garden, discussing the next steps for the project and the potential impact it could have. Thomas's optimism was contagious, his words carrying a sense of purpose that was impossible to ignore. As they returned to the house, Margot intercepted them in the hall, her expression unreadable. "There's a call for you, Mr. Wheeler," she said, holding out the phone. Thomas took the phone, his brow furrowing as he listened. Emma watched as his expression shifted, a mix of surprise and curiosity crossing his face. When he hung up, he turned to her, his eyes bright. "That was one of the investors," he said. "They're interested in expanding the project. They want to explore additional designs, adaptive technologies beyond mobility devices." Emma's heart leaped. "That's incredible, Thomas. It's more than I ever imagined," he admitted, "and it's going to take everything we've got." "Then we'd better get to work," Emma said with a smile. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. The success of the prototype had sparked a wave of interest, and Thomas found himself at the center of a burgeoning movement. The investors' proposal to expand the project opened new doors, bringing fresh challenges but also boundless opportunities. Emma worked closely with Thomas, coordinating with the production team, managing investor relations, and keeping the day-to-day operations running smoothly. Their partnership, once professional and distant, had evolved into something far deeper, a mutual respect and understanding born from shared struggles and triumphs. One afternoon, as they reviewed the latest design concepts, Thomas leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "Do you ever wonder how we got here?" he asked. Emma smiled faintly. "All the time." Thomas shook his head, a faint chuckle escaping him. "If you'd told me a year ago that I'd be sitting here, working on something like this, I would have called you crazy." "You've come a long way," Emma said softly. "And this is just the beginning." Thomas looked at her, his expression serious. "You've been a big part of that, Emma. I don't think I ever thanked you properly." "You don't have to thank me," Emma replied. "This was all you." Thomas's gaze didn't waver. "No, it wasn't. You believed in me when no one else did. That made all the difference." As evening fell, Emma prepared to leave, but before she stepped out the door, Thomas called after her. "Emma." She turned, her heart skipping at the rare use of her first name. "Yes." He hesitated for a moment, then said, "You've changed my life. I hope you know that." Emma felt her throat tighten, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've changed mine too." For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the weight of their shared journey hanging in the air. Then Emma smiled, nodding slightly before stepping into the cool evening air. On the subway ride home, Emma thought about how far they had come, how far Thomas had come. The man who had once been defined by his grief and bitterness had become a symbol of resilience, strength, and hope. And though the journey had been long and challenging, it had been worth every step. When she arrived home, Jake greeted her with his usual exuberance, his laughter filling the small apartment. As she tucked him into bed that night, she thought about the future, Thomas's, hers, and the countless lives they were working to change. And as she closed her eyes, she knew the best was yet to come. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.